I shall be crowned king. Hello again, dear adventurers of the multiverse. Thanks for joining us once more on this epic journey. Remember, this story is pure science fiction from our wild imagination. So don't go trying to summon dragons in your backyard. The rights of this amazing novel belong entirely to its original author. We are only the narrators. Do you want more adventures? Show some love to our YouTube channel with a subscription and a like. And if you want exclusive content, our Patreon is waiting for you with open arms. Chapter 26 Anson's Speech. This was a field cannon whose wheels alone were nearly as tall as a person, leaving deep ruts in the muddy trenches. A unicorn relief, symbolizing the kingdom of Clovis, stood proudly on the bronze-cast, golden cannon. Because the cannon was so heavy, even without the accompanying ammunition boxes, it weighed over a ton, it could only move slowly across the position. The normally spacious artillery camp was now packed with soldiers, who watched the heavy cannon slowly making its way through the trenches with surprise and admiration, praising it unanimously. Its sheen alone, its sheen of metal, gave the soldiers a sense of security, and they instinctively huddled around it, even pulling ropes to help the grenadier regiment escorting it. Clearly, even the new recruits who had just joined the conscription force could see that compared to the artillery of the 1st Regiment, this field cannon was in a completely different league in terms of length, weight, and the depth and width of its muzzle. Compared to her, the so-called bang-bang cannons were a disgrace to the artillery world, inferior beings that could only be called matchlock guns. The class difference between them was like that between a princess of a kingdom and a country bumpkin who appeared out of nowhere, vastly different. An entire company of grenadiers, with the assistance of almost the entire 1st Legion, struggled to drag the 2 field cannons and a 24-pound mortar into their designated positions within the artillery fortifications. Besides the 3 heavy cannons, ammunition boxes, and the corresponding artillerymen, the ammunition that was supposed to arrive several days later was also delivered to the 1st Legion's position, leaving Anson and Karl somewhat astonished. Clearly, although the entire artillery fortifications were still under construction, Ludwig was impatient. He was eager to arm his troops to the teeth, waiting for the Imperial defenders to come to him so he could exact revenge. That's all. The weapons and men have been delivered. Roman, hands behind his back, coldly stared at Anson, glancing at the dense, dark mass of soldiers behind him. From now on, this artillery position is yours, I understand. Anson nodded slightly, his expression unchanged. This shows Brigadier General Ludwig's trust in me, and I will not let him down, not just expectations, but absolutely no defeat. Roman's eyes met Anson's, his cold gaze carrying a subtle pressure. The price the Brigadier General paid for this victory could have formed another conscripted army in Thunderberg. If we lose this battle or anything goes wrong, the army will find a reason to kick him out, and he will never be able to return to the military. I will never let that happen. Looking at Roman's clearly threatening expression, Anson became wary. Any mishap? Had he discovered something? But upon closer reflection, Anson realized it was impossible. The positions of the 1st Platoon and the Grenadier Regiment were far apart, and his contact with Roman had only occurred during the interrogation of Louis Bernard and when he went to the Brigadier General's tent. Roman, as an officer, wouldn't have come to his tent without a reason, and Anson always carried the former Anson's diary with him. The commotion from the positions grew louder, and Roman, who had turned his back to leave, suddenly stopped, glancing sideways at Anson, who was also looking at him. Besides, this is just my personal suggestion. While there's still time, think about what you'll do after the siege ends. If you survive, thank you, I'll think about it. Anson nodded in thanks, but his expression was somewhat strange. This confidant of Brigadier General Ludwig really didn't forget to give himself a good talking to. After the 3 cannons and the remaining ammunition boxes were all handed over, the stern-faced Lieutenant Colonel Roman and his grenadiers quickly reformed into column in the crowd, turned and left with a marching gait that would put even the honor guard to shame, without lingering for a moment. The privates surrounding them watched them leave, and the once bustling artillery position suddenly became much quieter. Just then, 1st Regiment, all troops, listen to my command. Karl Bain's sudden shout startled everyone. 3 lines, close formation, assemble. Yes, sir. The bewildered soldiers instinctively reacted, quickly shouldering their weapons, straightening their uniforms, and assembling in their respective ranks at the artillery position. Even Lena, who had just been sulking with him, hurriedly carried a rifle several hoods taller than herself, rushing to the front of the line, with bits of canned meat still stuck to her lips and cheeks. 2 minutes later, Looking at the neat and orderly line in front of him, Carl finally nodded and turned to walk towards Anson. "What are you doing?" Anson asked Carl with a puzzled look, deliberately lowering his voice. "Do what I think I won't regret." Carl spoke lazily, but his gaze towards Anson was utterly earnest. "The day the main force fled, we didn't follow them. Instead, we believed in you and chose to stay, fighting against an enemy 3 times our size at the fortified position. The day of the cavalry raid, we still believed in you. 200 scum soldiers withstood the encirclement of 300 Imperial cavalry and held the position. Now we still believe in you, building fortifications beneath the fortress's cannons, and we will continue to believe in you, believing you will lead us to retake Thunder Fortress, instead of going to your deaths." Carl suddenly paused, reaching for Anson's collar but slowly lowering his hand, his dark-circled eyes radiating unwavering determination. "Anson Bach, my commander. Don't you think you should say something to these people who believe in you?" Looking into Carl's eyes, Anson remained silent for a full minute. He glanced at the nearly completed fortress behind him, then turned, his deep brown eyes sweeping over the first column of soldiers standing in neat formation. He saw their expressions. Some were bewildered, some resolute, some feigned composure, some numb, some brave, some cowardly, some anxious, some determined, a whole variety of emotions. Some were veterans who had fought alongside him twice, some were new recruits just brought in from the rear, and some were simply fighting for food to avoid starvation. But now they would all be like him, fighting for survival, for a battle that had nothing to do with him, to reclaim a fortress whose significance they didn't even understand. In that instant, Anson felt a surge of emotion welling up in his chest, making him tremble. "Soldiers!" A passionate shout exploded from Anson's throat, instantly drawing all eyes within the fortress to him. In less than 4 days, under the threat of enemy artillery fire, you built this impregnable fortress shovel by shovel. With your sweat, you extended the trenches towards the enemy's fortress. Now it is yours. The banner and bugle call to advance on Thunder Fortress are firmly in the hands of the 1st Regiment. When the battle begins, you will be the ones to fire the first shot to retake the fortress." As he spoke, Anson strode to the edge of the fortress, standing directly on the unprotected wall, straightening his back and looking down at the soldiers. "Soldiers! Whatever difficulties we face next, don't be afraid, face them with a smile. The best way to overcome difficulties is, thump." Just as Anson excitedly prepared to imitate Ludwig drawing his sword, a loud bang came from behind him. Anson stopped abruptly, his expression frozen, turning around as if he vaguely guessed something. Then, boom, a solid shot smashed a huge hole in the fortress wall a dozen meters to his right. Instantly, the atmosphere in the entire fortress became quiet. "Enemy fire! Take cover in the trenches!" Carl Bain's heart-wrenching shout rang out, and the once impeccably disciplined privates scattered like birds. Amidst the billowing dust, Anson, stunned and momentarily frozen, jolted awake and leaped from the ramparts into the artillery emplacement, rushing into the trenches without looking back, leaving behind only an empty, unfinished artillery position. On the 15th day of the siege of Thunder Fortress, Anson Bach, a soon-to-be graduate of the Royal Military Academy, a lieutenant colonel, and commander of the 1st Private Regiment of the conscripted army, abruptly ended his first-ever battlefield speech amidst a misfire by Imperial artillery. Chapter 27 Military Council. On the 17th day of the siege of Thunder Castle, everything unfolded almost exactly as Carl Bain had predicted. The Imperial Army, initially indifferent to the situation outside the city, began periodically setting up light infantry guns and mortars on the city walls, targeting the front lines and artillery positions. Clearly, they weren't oblivious to the conscripts' movements, but rather didn't want to waste ammunition before figuring out the main attack direction. Faced with this highly targeted artillery fire, and after suffering dozens of casualties, the enthusiasm of the conscripts for the trench offensive quickly plummeted. In the worst-case scenario, only the officers' whipping and beatings could motivate the soldiers to risk being killed by artillery fire to build fortifications, and even after being attacked, they would immediately retreat to their positions. Even if the supervising officers held guns to their heads, they would resolutely refuse to go back. Risk was one thing, willingly sacrificing oneself was another. Moreover, the soldiers were also a significant asset for the mid-level officers, and excessive casualties risked being stripped of their ranks and pay by the army. For 2 whole days, the advance on the front lines was negligible, and much of it had even been damaged by the Imperial garrison. But that wasn't the worst of it. After the setbacks at the front, terrifying rumors also spread from the rear. Traces of a large number of Imperial cavalry had been spotted passing through Oak, the conscripts' logistics base. Although Brigadier General Ludwig tried to stop the rumors from spreading immediately, it was to little avail, and the morale of the entire conscript army plummeted to rock bottom in a short time. Faced with this situation, Ludwig could only hope that the infantry regiment sent to Oak would perform its duties diligently, and that the steam train carrying the next batch of supplies would arrive as soon as possible. Although he was quite pessimistic about both, especially the former. "Gentlemen, we must solve the immediate problem." In the spacious tent, Ludwig, his face extremely grim, took a deep breath, trying to remain as calm as possible as he looked at all his direct officers sitting on either side of the Thunderkessel sand table. Anson Bach, as the commander of the 1st platoon, was naturally among them, and luckily became one of the more conspicuous ones. After all, the officers present all knew how this soon-to-be graduate, who was only a junior officer not long ago, had successfully risen to be on equal footing with them, even though the former commander, Willen Small, was purely courting death and had nothing to do with Anson. It still filled the eyes looking at him with vigilance and indifference. Of course, this absolutely did not include a certain grenadier commander. Feeling the undisguised cold gaze coming towards him, Anson pretended not to notice and gave Roman a polite smile opposite him. 2 days. 2 whole days, and the advance of the front lines is less than a tenth of what it used to be. Even as he struggled to control his emotions, Ludwig couldn't help but raise his voice. "At this rate, it will take us at least another 30 to 40 days to complete the siege and begin the attack on Remmenburg. I can assure you all now that the Privy Council and the Southern Army headquarters will absolutely not give us another 40 days. At that time, I, as the commander, will be held accountable, and none of you should think you'll get away with it easily. The lucky ones will be sent to the east, and the unlucky ones will be stripped of their ranks and become vagrants outside the train station." Under this undisguised and particularly realistic threat, the officers, already fearful, turned pale and trembled like children who had done something wrong. But even if we're not afraid to die, it's useless. In the oppressive atmosphere, a regimental commander mustered his courage and stood up. The Imperial Army's artillery barrage is extremely fierce and targeted. The newly built fortifications are completely ineffective. One volley of artillery fire and they're done for. No offense, Brigadier General, but unless we possess long-range firepower sufficient to suppress the fortress, we cannot persuade our soldiers to risk being blown up to dig trenches. Almost as soon as the commander finished speaking, the other officers, equally deeply moved, also stood up, full of complaints. "Exactly. Besides, digging trenches is expensive, and the soldiers are already dissatisfied with the current rations. Request reinforcements from the Southern Legion. We're helping them fight. Why don't they have to contribute? Our firepower is severely insufficient right now. We should wait for heavy artillery to arrive, otherwise, we simply cannot attack a well-stocked, heavily fortified fortress like Thunder Fortress." "That's right. Why are we only given 40 days? What fortress in this world can be taken in just 40 days? Noise, shouts, curses, a cacophony of sounds filled every corner of the tent. All the officers were raising their voices as loud as they could. Their boastful words and powerful gestures suggested they would be just as valiant on the battlefield. "Silence," Ludwig said softly, tapping the table lightly. Instantly, the tent fell silent. The officers sitting on either side of the sand table stared motionless at the Brigadier General, completely different from their state a moment before. A helpless expression flashed across Ludwig's face as his cold gaze swept over a man who had been quiet and smiling the entire time. "Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, everyone was just criticizing your plan, nothing to say in your defense." In the blink of an eye, all eyes were on Anson. Feeling those undeniably friendly gazes, Anson let out a long sigh and slowly rose, raising his hand to shield the Thunder Fortress sand table from the light of the kerosene lamps. Then he turned to Ludwig, who was waiting for his reply. "We can try digging at night." Ludwig thought for a few seconds. "That would be very costly, and mobilizing the entire army would be risky, so we shouldn't mobilize the entire army for this. 1 or 2,000 men will suffice." Anson looked at him seriously. "Just extend a small portion of the position. A strong, narrow position is enough to defend against the fortress's artillery fire and can serve as a bridgehead and main attack position during the attack. It can accommodate about 1 or 2,000 men. 1 or 2,000 men can take Thunder Fortress." Roman looked coldly at Anson. "The Imperial Army inside the city has at most 1 or 2,000 men." Anson shrugged. "We have nearly 800 men in Lieutenant Colonel Roman's Grenadier Regiment alone." Are you that lacking in confidence? It's caution, Roman snorted. Besides, they control the fortress and the city's defenses. With the same number of troops, we have no advantage, that's right, but the imperial infantry are rigid and inflexible, with low morale and often collapse at the first contact. They are not durable at all, while our conscripts, they seem just as rubbish. After a moment's hesitation, Anson gave the brigadier general a resolute look. Much stronger than them, Ludwig scoffed. He was almost certain that this had been part of Anson's plan from the beginning. He had long suspected the imperial army would counterattack, but only told him now. But if questioned now, this guy would definitely say that he hadn't asked, not that Anson hadn't warned him, and besides, he had indeed warned him. 1 or 2,000 infantrymen with artillery cover might not be enough to capture Thunderberg, but at least it could open a gap for the rear troops, creating an opportunity for a full-scale offensive. Seeing that no one stood up to object, Anson continued, of course, we also have to consider the possibility of a failed attack, but the principle is the same. A small but elite force can more easily withdraw from the battle quickly, and besides, the enemy's forces are not many. Even if they win, they won't dare to pursue us. At most they'll use artillery barrage to scare us. After speaking, Anson put his hands behind his back and looked at Ludwig, waiting for his reply. On either side of the sand table, the gazes that had initially been hostile towards Anson softened considerably, except for Roman, of course. Clearly, the officers considered the plan fantastic, not so much for the possibility of victory, but because it offered them a huge advantage. If there was hope, they could rush in and claim the credit. If the situation turned unfavorable, they only needed to cover friendly forces as much as possible. In short, some might profit, but they would definitely not lose. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 28: The Mentor's Letter. To think things through more calmly, Ludwig dismissed all the officers from his tent until he made a decision. However, in Anson's eyes, this essentially meant Ludwig was admitting his plan was correct, but unwilling to appear indecisive or blindly following his advice, so he wanted to carefully decide alone. This way, when he decided to implement the plan later, it would look like he had listened to everyone's opinions and made a decision independently. Basically, he was a somewhat awkward and overly concerned with saving face. Anson, his mind filled with complaints, couldn't help but smile. But there was an advantage. If the plan failed afterward, the blame wouldn't fall solely on Anson, since it was a collective suggestion. Everyone shared responsibility. Everyone being responsible meant no one was held accountable. Understanding this, Anson's smile deepened. Just then, a young man in an army sergeant's uniform, with a leather pouch slung over his left shoulder, stepped forward and saluted Anson with a tentative tone, striking his chest. "Excuse me, are you Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach?" Anson returned the salute with a nod, and the young man's eyes lit up immediately upon receiving the reply. "Great. Here's a letter for you, sent from Oaktown 2 days ago. It seems the sender is a professor from the academy." Sorry for asking, please sign for it." "A professor? Sent to me?" Anson frowned slightly as he took the letter from the young man. The seal had a shield-like pattern on it, indicating that the sender was no ordinary person. Watching the messenger's departing figure, Anson hesitated for a moment before finally opening the letter. "Dear Anson Bach, it has been many years since you left the Church Academy to study at the military academy as a special student. Do you still remember your past yearning for history and geography? To this day, I still remember the boy who always pressed me for answers after class about the history of the Clovis dynasty and the Age of Discovery. It is you, these inquisitive children, always full of curiosity about the world, who have rekindled my desire for knowledge time and time again. Therefore, you cannot imagine how excited I was when you wrote to me again to ask me about historical questions. I so admire the energy of you young people and your discerning eye that can find enjoyment in the vastness of history. To get back to the point, when I heard that you were about to complete your internship, I planned to go to the southern fortress to meet you. However, the war broke out, and the security in Barreltown was so bad that I couldn't hire a carriage. So I have no choice but to answer your question about the surname August with this letter. First, I must confirm your guess. This is indeed a very traditional and ancient Clovis surname. Its existence even predates the royal family of Austria, dating back to the ancient Clovis kingdom. and it has some connection with the prominent rune family within the kingdom. Unfortunately, the true August bloodline has long since died out. The available information is very fragmented, mostly just hearsay, such as dark creatures and evil magic. However, I haven't given up. I plan to return to the Academy's library to investigate further. I hope you will have finished your military service and return to the capital to join this enjoyable exploration by then. May the Ring of Order protect you. Your history professor, mentor, and like-minded friend, Mace Hornard. Snap! Anson jolted awake, a sudden movement drawing stares from those around him. What's wrong? Roman approached, his expression as cold as ever. History professor, he was my favorite in the academy, and in a way, my mentor. Anson slowly unfolded the crumpled letter, trying his best not to lie. We haven't seen each other for many years, so I didn't expect him to still be willing to reply to my letter. Roman, who hadn't said a word, stared directly into Anson's eyes, his cold pupils gradually narrowing into slits. This silence lasted for more than 10 seconds. After observing Anson, who showed no abnormality, Roman turned and left. How are you? When the tension finally relaxed, Anson realized that the back of his neck was covered in cold sweat. Examining the elegant and neat handwriting on the letter, he was now 100% certain that this Mace Hornard was the dark mage he had been negotiating with. And the other party was indeed the history professor formerly at the Church Academy, and had been infiltrating the conscription army under a false identity, constantly monitoring him. But now none of that mattered anymore. The other party was willing to take the risk of writing such a letter and revealing his name, so he had most likely already left the military. So what exactly prompted the other party to leave, and why they had to write such a letter before leaving? This would probably have to be answered by asking the history professor in person at the academy. After returning to the capital, Anson breathed a slight sigh of relief, then carefully examined the contents of the letter again. It was basically an answer to the last question he had raised during their last meeting, the most trivial and harmless one. But since the other party was willing to take the risk of writing to him and went to great lengths to ensure he received it, the letter's contents were definitely more than they appeared. Was it a warning that the August family's history was complex, and that he shouldn't get involved without being mentally prepared? No. Anson frowned and rejected his speculation. This kind of question wasn't worth the concern of a member of an underground evil organization, nor was it like the Black Mage's style. What would make the other party take the risk must be something that would affect his plan, the successful capture of Thunder Fortress. Southern Fortress, Barrel Town. Anson's gaze locked onto the only two place names in the entire letter. Because of the Empire's sudden and massive winter invasion, the Southern Legion was put on the defensive, and it might even lose one or two important border fortresses, causing the war to spread into the interior and potentially leading to territorial losses. However, at least in the short term, Anson saw no hope of a quick victory for the Empire. The winter offensive was indeed unexpected, but it came at a price. Even on the defensive, the elite Southern Legion wouldn't collapse so quickly. Having memories of serving at the Southern Fortress, Anson was confident in that fortress. As for Barrel Town, Anson thought about it carefully. There were indeed many rumors recently about large numbers of Imperial cavalry appearing near Barrel Town. Could it be that Carl Bane's other jinx was about to come true? A little panicked, Anson heard footsteps behind him, so he folded the letter again and put it in his coat pocket, pretending to be calm as he stood still. Brigadier General's order. Everyone returned to the meeting room. Roman, standing in the crowd, coldly announced, "Be prepared, it's time to announce the orders." With that, he turned and was the first to enter the tent. The officers around him exchanged anxious glances, gradually returning to their seats on either side of the sand table. At the far end of the sand table, Ludwig, elbows propped on the table and fingers interlaced, still had a stern expression, but one could sense that he was much happier than before, as if he had finally made a decision after much hesitation and was now relieved. "Gentlemen, I have made my decision, and I do not intend to seek the opinions of any of you again." Scanning the sand table, Ludwig said in a deep voice, "I have decided to use the two newly established artillery positions as the core to build a forward position that can serve as the main attack area during the siege. Starting at 7 o'clock tonight, a quarter of the entire army will be responsible for this project, and will rotate over the next 4 days. The soldiers performing the mission will receive extra rations and a small allowance, which will be fully covered by the conscription logistics and..." Ludwig suddenly stopped speaking, staring at the messenger who had suddenly burst into the tent, the same person who had just delivered the message to Anson. What's going on? Latest intelligence. Brigadier General, the messenger, panting heavily, stood at the tent entrance and hurriedly saluted Ludwig, sent from Oaktown. Chapter 29 Bad News. Oakwood Town. The moment Anson heard the name, a flicker of unease crossed his eyes. Not just him, but the atmosphere throughout the entire tent shifted uncomfortably. Oakwood Town wasn't a particularly special city, not even a true city, just an ordinary little town with a regular market, taverns, and frequent stops for caravans. No clean streets, no towering buildings. Its dilapidated state wouldn't inspire any lingering interest in travelers. Yet, within this town lay the newly built railway station of the kingdom, where all supplies and troop replenishment relied on steam trains, and it was also a crucial logistical base for the Thunder Fortress conscripts. If something happened to Oakwood Town, the conscripts besieging the positions would face annihilation. Covered in sweat and still panting heavily, the messenger stood innocently at the tent entrance, subjected to gazes from every corner of the tent, each angle reflecting a different emotion. This oppressive silence lasted for nearly half a minute. Suddenly, Roman, who hadn't uttered a word, stood up, took the incredibly heavy letter from the messenger, and bypassed everyone to go directly to Ludwig's side. The relieved messenger fled the tent with the fastest speed he'd ever traveled. "General, read it." Ludwig, his face unchanged, spoke in a low voice. Roman hesitated for a moment, then silently returned to his position, taking a deep breath. "Scouts report a large number of Imperial cavalry spotted south of Oaktown." Louder, Ludwig growled. "Scouts report that a small number of Imperial cavalry have been spotted south of Oaktown, showing signs of frequent activity along the supply line from our positions to Oaktown," Roman said in a deep voice, his head bowed. "In the north, 2 watchtowers were attacked by the enemy. We mobilized 2 companies of privates to retake the outposts, but they had been looted, and none of the defenders survived. Under the Brigadier General's orders, our army quickly established several defensive fortifications around Oaktown, demolished some abandoned houses to reinforce the existing walls, and issued hand grenades to patrolling soldiers for timely warning of enemy cavalry attacks. After the 2 attacks, our scouts have located the approximate location of the Imperial Army's encampment by following the enemy's retreat routes and tracks. Therefore, we have applied to the Brigadier General for approval to launch an encirclement and annihilation offensive against the Imperial cavalry. Eliminating the threat in its infancy, the resounding voice echoed on the sand table, and Ludwig nodded slightly. Although 2 outposts were destroyed, they were at least quickly recaptured, and the infantry commander stationed in Oaktown hadn't forgotten to consult before the operation. The situation was far better than he had imagined. "Draft a restoration plan for me, and tell him I understand the situation, but I disagree with his plan to encircle and annihilate the Imperial cavalry." After a moment's thought, Ludwig looked at Roman. "You will set off immediately tomorrow, leading the Grenadier Regiment to replace him, and wipe out these Imperial scum in the shortest possible time." "Yes, sir," Roman responded, standing motionless, his gaze locked tightly with Ludwig's. Anson, who had just breathed a sigh of relief, vaguely sensed something amiss from their expressions. "Everyone out. Immediately. No one is allowed to come in until I make a decision." With that, the stern-faced Ludwig raised his hand to stop Anson, who was about to rise. "You and Roman stay." Anson, somewhat bewildered, froze, then obediently sat back down. A few minutes later, only 3 figures remained in the quiet tent. Ludwig slowly turned his head to look at Roman, as if using all his strength. "Speak. What you just said was actually intelligence from 3 days ago?" Roman spoke slowly, a hint of unease appearing in his usually cold eyes. "The truth is, the infantry regiment stationed in Oaktown has been completely annihilated by the Imperial cavalry, and the town's warehouses have been extensively burned and looted by the enemy. Civilian casualties are not heavy, but the entire town's order has been completely destroyed." Anything else?" Ludwig appeared very calm. "The train platform has been destroyed by the enemy." Roman hesitated for a moment. "According to the description in the letter, it will take at least 10 days to repair." What about that infantry regiment? Did they leave their post without my orders?" "It seems they were lured out of the city by the enemy and then surrounded and annihilated. There were no survivors." "What about the commander?" "Missing, probably dead." "What about the messenger?" "At the field hospital. I sent 2 grenadiers to look after him." "Good." Ludwig nodded as if deep in thought, calmly standing up. Then, he slammed his foot on the sand table. Thump. With a loud crash, the sand table overturned. The anger he had been desperately suppressing for so long erupted completely at this moment. "It's over, all over." The sliver of hope he had fought so hard for, the one he had desperately fought for, had now been destroyed by a scoundrel who disobeyed orders. A chill ran down Ludwig's spine. Enraged to the extreme, he knew perfectly well what would happen once this news reached the officers and soldiers. Turmoil, rout, mutiny. Without supply lines and logistics, even without reinforcements, the army's morale was low. Nothing would be surprising. What to do? What to do? In the deathly silent tent, Anson, awkwardly seated, raised his right hand. "Excuse me, may I say something?" "Speak." Ludwig, his eyes blazing with fury, stared at Anson as if he wanted to devour him. "All right," carefully observing the hound-like Roman and the brigadier general, who resembled a misfired rifle, Anson took a deep breath and tentatively spoke. "General, do you think the current situation is hopeless?" Ludwig gave a self-deprecating laugh. "Speak your mind, no need for sarcasm." Ludwig, straightening up, coldly looked down at Anson, who was sitting in the chair. "Is the situation hopeless? Didn't you hear Roman's words, or are you playing dumb? We have completely lost our logistics and all support." "That's right, we've lost our logistics and all support," Anson nodded, calmly looking up at Ludwig, "but we still have several thousand soldiers, strong positions, ample ammunition, and barely enough logistics to hold out 5 days. Roman suddenly spoke up. "If we cut costs, we can hold out for at least 5 more days. 5 more days. In other words, we have a full 5 days to take Thunderberg." Anson, having slightly bowed and kicked his chair away, stood up to meet Ludwig's gaze. "In conclusion, General, I believe the situation is not yet hopeless. Everything is still within the plan." "Within the plan?" Ludwig's sneer froze. Then he looked at Anson seriously. "You mean, you have a way to take Thunderberg within 5 days?" "No," Anson shook his head. "But I have a way to make taking Thundercastle within 5 days a possibility." Ludwig, who had been stunned for a moment, instantly became angry. "What's the difference?" "A huge difference, General." Anson took a half step back to prevent Ludwig, who had just kicked over the sand table, from kicking him again. "Can you let me finish?" "Go on." "Right now, we need to do 2 things immediately. First, ensure that the army doesn't mutiny. Second, find a way to get intelligence from inside Thundercastle as soon as possible." Anson, thinking quickly, tried his best to reassure him. "The most important thing is definitely the first one, and Lieutenant Colonel Roman did a great job on that. We absolutely cannot let the soldiers know about Oaktown, but we also can't let them know nothing. Once the logistical supplies are depleted and there are no reinforcements, even a fool would know what's going on. So my suggestion is, let the news of the supply line attack get out, and at the same time, have your trusted officers stabilize the situation in Oaktown, and then send people to communicate with the rear. The soldiers know what's happening but aren't desperate. And even if they wanted to escape, the Imperial cavalry are nowhere to be seen outside the lines. Deserting on their own is practically suicide. Staying on the lines is actually safer." At this point, Ludwig finally calmed down. "And the second one?" Anson smiled confidently. "The second one. I need to talk to Louis Bernard first before I can give you an answer." Chapter 30 Persuasion. "Lord Anson Bach, it's good to see you again." The young knight sat in the dim candlelight, a faint smile on his handsome face as Anson entered the cell. The days and nights of imprisonment had left Louis Bernard slightly haggard, but his clear eyes still shone brightly, and his upright posture showed no signs of exhaustion. "You knew I would come." Anson, sitting down opposite the confident Louis, was filled with surprise. "I didn't know, but your presence here speaks volumes." Louis's tone was certain, his eyes even carrying a hint of smugness. "Having already obtained all the information about bloodline power from me, and unable to inquire about the defenses of Thundercastle due to circumstances, what could be the reason for your reappearance? There's only one answer. Your siege of the fortress was ruthlessly crushed by my brother Crow, leaving the battle stagnant and even at risk of failure, which is why you remembered me, a captured fellow, right, Anson?" Even Louis, naive to the extreme, deduced so much important information from his own appearance, proving that anyone who says there are fools in this world is a liar. "Yes, you're right," without hesitation, Lauren readily admitted. "We were badly beaten by your brother, almost to the point of utter defeat. If the fighting continues as it is now, forget about retaking Thundercastle. Even safely bringing back the thousands of people outside will be impossible." This overly frank opening statement surprised Louis, but a hint of wariness immediately appeared in his youthful brows. He knew very well that the person in front of him would not, and could not, admit defeat so easily. "Then may I ask, what do you want from me right now?" Lewis leaned forward slightly, looking nervously at Anson. If it's for a safe retreat, I can ask your brother on your behalf, but I don't think that's what Lord Anson wants, and you wouldn't let me, a prisoner, leave so easily, would you? No, that's exactly what I want. Anson shook his head, his expression very sincere. Huh? Lewis froze, his serious expression instantly crumbling. You could say, not entirely that. Anson suddenly changed the subject, pausing to think for a moment, but you can understand it that way, because the requirements are basically the same. What exactly do you want? Completely bewildered, Lewis could no longer contain himself. Anson cautiously looked at him. Could I explain in more detail? Please speak. The single word was practically squeezed out from between the young knight's teeth. Anson nodded, letting out a slight sigh of relief. Sigh. Lewis was like this, and so was Ludwig. Why were the people listening to his explanations always so easily impatient? I won't go into the specific details, but the situation is roughly like this. Anson coughed twice, his expression turning serious again. Your brother, relying on the firepower advantage of Thundercastle over the past few days, has greatly weakened our morale and made the advance of the siege position extremely difficult, putting us on the defensive. So now my plan is to use you as an exchange to get Thundercastle to stop shelling for the next few days. Do you think this condition is acceptable? Of course, there are other additional terms, but those have nothing to do with you, Anson said sincerely. Lewis bit his lower lip and remained silent for a while before speaking with some disbelief. You really intend to let me leave? Yes. What about your superior? Will he agree? Don't worry about that. I'll find a way to persuade him. No one chooses to die when they can live, not even a naive and simple knight. At least in Louis Bernard's fantasy, he should die on the battlefield, struck by a stray bullet just before victory. At least being secretly executed by the enemy in prison or committing a humiliating suicide was definitely not an option for him. But I have one last question. Taking a deep breath, Lewis, who vaguely sensed a possible conspiracy, said in a deep voice, if you let me go back, how will you guarantee that the Imperial Army will keep its promise and not immediately turn against us? Anson's face showed a smile that said, I knew you would ask this. Like the previous question, this has nothing to do with you, but it won't hurt to explain. The basis of negotiation is trust, of course. We will convey the news that you are still alive to the garrison inside the fortress. We will only be willing to negotiate after they are willing to cease fire for a day, then it will depend on your efforts. Although we are enemies now, would a knight of high moral character easily break the promise he made just because of hostility? As soon as he finished speaking, the young knight, caught in a dilemma, had an extremely complicated expression. I disagree. Before Anson could finish speaking, Roman, looking slightly shocked, turned to Ludwig. General, Louis Bernard's status is extremely high. We cannot take such an important prisoner without the Privy Council's permission. Even if you were the Emperor, he's worth less than a cannonball to you now. Anson interrupted abruptly, bowing slightly to Roman, who was glaring at him. Louis Bernard, who doesn't understand the situation of the Thunder Fortress garrison, is currently worth almost nothing to us. We also have to constantly worry about him escaping. It would be better to use him to exchange for a promise from the Imperial garrison. Even if they don't keep their promise, it doesn't matter. Even if they can only be used to probe the situation inside the city, it can still be helpful in the subsequent battle. As for the army and the Privy Council, they were planning to see you fail from the beginning anyway, so why should you care what they think? But if it's discovered later, you will still be held accountable, Roman said coldly, trading a mistake that will inevitably lead to accusations for intelligence whose veracity is impossible to ascertain. This is your so-called everything is going according to plan. Anson shrugged, looking at him innocently. I only guaranteed that we would capture Thunderberg. I never guaranteed anything else. Besides, even if we were accused, the cost would be far less than the consequences of defeat. The two are incomparable. Roman, unable to contain himself any longer, was about to rush forward when Ludwig raised his hand to stop him. Under the Brigadier General's resolute gaze, Roman pursed his lips and silently took a half-step back. Even if I agree to your request, Ludwig immediately grasped the most important issue, but this Imperial Knight is stubborn and fearless. He'll definitely guess there's a conspiracy involved. That's right. Even if he doesn't, the commander of the garrison at Thunder Fortress will easily realize that our aim isn't a ceasefire, but rather to lower the guard. That's inevitable, but whether they discover it or not, whether they're willing to keep their promise or not, We'll gain a precious little time to completely complete the fortifications of the forward positions. As long as the garrison commander still cares about his brother's life, that's guaranteed. Exchanging a worthless prisoner for a day of ceasefire is absolutely worthwhile. Having figured this out, Ludwig had no more doubts. How quickly can you persuade Louis Bernard? No problem. The young knight, now fully convinced, sat up straight and nodded solemnly. If it's just a short-term ceasefire and doesn't involve city defenses, I believe I can persuade my brother. I will immediately relay this message to the Brigadier General and begin exchange negotiations as soon as possible. It won't be long before you regain your freedom. Anson smiled, but inwardly, 1,000 waves surged within him. At this moment, he was completely certain that the Imperial Army and the Old Gods faction within the city were forcing the conscripted army to attack the city quickly so they could find a way to pin the blame on the kingdom of Clovis and himself. Since the enemy was almost ready, at the stage of urging them to attack, he would attack the city immediately before they were fully prepared. Tonight, he would hold the ritual and become a spellcaster. Chapter 31 Ritual. Midnight, moonless. Yawning, Lisa sat cross-legged on the earthen wall outside the tent, struggling to keep her eyes open. Her right hand, tucked tightly into her blouse, clutched the can of meat Anson had given her. According to their agreement, if Lisa could endure the night without mentioning it to anyone, she would receive another can of meat. After confirming several times that no one else was outside the tent besides Lisa, Anson finally breathed a sigh of relief and began preparing for the ritual. Although it was somewhat rushed, and extremely risky in the crowded military camp, he truly couldn't wait any longer. The Old Gods faction within Thunder Fortress could act at any moment, and Ludwig was already cornered. Battle could break out at any time. Even with a risk of exposure, he had to take the gamble. Lying prone on the cleared ground, Anson, chalk in hand, meticulously drew a six-pointed star magic circle on the ground. Drawing a magic circle large enough for a person to stand on was no easy feat, far more difficult than it appeared. A slight miscalculation could result in a crooked line or an excess or deficiency. Coupled with the constant vigilance required to detect any movement outside the tent, what should have been an easy task took a full 30 minutes. After drawing it with chalk, Anson used a sharp stone to carve over the marks, then carefully used a bayonet to cut his palm, ensuring it was properly bandaged before letting the squeezed blood drip into the stone's marks. Another nearly 30 minutes of work. Although the Dark Mage had mentioned that as long as the shape of the six-pointed star was roughly discernible, and perfect precision wasn't required, nor was any blood sacrifice necessary, Anson, doing this for the first time, decided to play it safe. After completely completing the six-pointed star magic circle, Anson took a deep breath, checked the situation outside the tent one last time, and then slowly knelt in the center of the circle, his hands hanging at his sides. As memories not his own began to surface in his mind, Anson began to chant in a low voice, in a language he didn't even recognize, a language he didn't even understand. I hereby swear, I will sever all shackles and grasp destiny in my own hands. Closing his eyes, Anson, filled with unease, awaited what was to come. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. Nothing seemed to have happened. Boom, an indescribable explosion suddenly shattered in his mind. Almost simultaneously, his relaxed body began to convulse uncontrollably. The muscles in his limbs and neck tensed as if pulled by chains. Anson, his head involuntarily raised, suddenly opened his eyes, his taut face becoming terrifying and grotesque, his trembling, rolling eyes gradually becoming bloodshot. His once perfectly clear and rational consciousness blurred with the sound of the explosion, slowly sinking, as if being completely stripped away, gradually losing control and sensation over his body. He felt himself rising. No, it was more like a fall, like losing the anchor holding him to the ground. He was plummeting towards the boundless dome. Eerie shrieks, heart-wrenching screams, and furious roars echoed in his ears, transforming into a raging hurricane, relentlessly tearing at his body. A flicker of panic finally crept into his chaotic consciousness. He was still falling, still relentlessly falling towards the bottomless dome. He fell deeper and deeper until the hoarse, eerie echoes in his ears disappeared, and the surrounding air grew increasingly thin. What had been almost instinctive breathing became increasingly difficult. But as the fall continued, this suffocation transformed into a subtle sensation, even a faint sense of comfort. As if completely relaxed, Anson opened his eyes, greeted by an endless sea of fog, a boundless, hazy fog. Freed from his restraints, the uncontrollable self was about to plunge into the sea of mist, He didn't even feel there was anything wrong with continuing to fall, since it didn't seem like. Boom! Without warning, a deafening roar erupted, and the sea of mist burst into flames. The next second, the raging inferno seemed to come alive, coalescing into countless tongues of fire in Anson's horrified gaze, rushing towards him from all directions. His frail figure was instantly engulfed. Although he was freed from his body's restraints, he could still clearly feel the pain of being consumed by the flames, an indescribable agony, a trembling pain that surpassed even the intensity of heat. His hair turned to ashes, his skin and flesh dissolved bit by bit, his blood evaporated, and his bones turned the color of charcoal, twisting, shattering, and disappearing without a trace in the scorching flames. Only a heart remained. A heart branded with a slightly scorching six-pointed star magic circle. He plunged through the burning sea of mist, falling downwards. This time, it was a true fall. Boom! In the instant of the loud noise, his falling consciousness was once again bound by the chains, forcibly pulled back to his body. His tense body suddenly freed, causing Anson, with his eyes closed, to collapse headfirst into the six-pointed star magic circle he had drawn. As if suddenly awakened, his entire body was covered in cold sweat, and his freed chest gasped for air mixed with the smell of gunpowder. Ha, ha, ha. A continuous sharp pain shot through his head and chest. Desperately suppressing the urge to vomit, Anson opened his eyes with almost all his might. It was still the dark, cramped tent, still the cold, hard earth, only the six-pointed star magic circle he had drawn had vanished without a trace. Enduring the pain, Anson struggled to turn to his side and pulled his brass pocket watch from his coat pocket. He had initially thought it was broken, but after talking to the young knight, he learned that it needed to be wound up over time. He still remembered the regretful expression on the other man's face as he wound a watch by candlelight and handed it back to him. That sigh wasn't for him, but for some unworthy watchmaker. He gently pressed the switch, and the flipped-up brass cover revealed a scratched dial. The shorthand had smoothly reached 4, and was only a short distance from 5 hours. It feels like less than a minute. After his breathing gradually calmed, Anson sat up and examined his hands and feet. Apart from a faint burning sensation in his chest near his heart, there were no other noticeable changes. A few more minutes passed, and even that faint burning sensation subsided, leaving nothing behind. So did I succeed, or fail? Anson suddenly realized a serious problem. He had no way to confirm his success. No, wait, he seemed to have one. A jolt ran through him as Anson pulled the letter from history professor Mace Hornard, the letter from the Black Mage, from his jacket pocket. Carefully opening the letter, Anson skipped over the contents and meticulously examined every detail and position. It was an ordinary-looking letter, nothing special, but if that were truly the case, the sender wouldn't have taken the risk of ensuring his receipt. Therefore, there was definitely something wrong with it, and only if he was the recipient. After examining it carefully several times, confirming there were no hidden layers or concealed ink in the light-colored writing, Anson remained silent for a moment before laying the letter flat beside him and slightly loosening the bandage on his palm. For some reason, his wound had almost healed in just a few hours, forcing Anson to make a small cut on his fingertip and drip blood onto the letter. Splat! The smooth paper instantly absorbed the blood, leaving no trace. The next second, an elegant line of handwriting appeared at the end of the letter. My dear friend, may the ancient God bless you on this moonless night. Chapter 32 Spellcasters. I must commend your keen insight, dear fellow believer. Discovering the secret of this letter proves not only your thirst for historical truth but also your attention to detail. Believe me, this is crucial for a spellcaster, and now that you have completed the most important ritual, our next step is to make you a qualified spellcaster. Sure enough. Inside the pitch-black tent, looking at the blood-stained words on the letter, Anson's lips curled into a cold smile. After learning the Dark Mage's true identity, Anson had initially mistakenly believed that a teacher-student relationship had led the other party to so easily impart spells and rituals to him. Now it seemed the ritual was merely the first step. Becoming a true spellcaster was far more complex than a simple ritual, and the Dark Mage could use every step in between to lure or control him, making him his own. Very much in line with the style of an underground evil organization, without exception. With a touch of regret, Anson turned his gaze to the next line. As you know, even today, the blasphemous Church of Order still vilifies the old gods. They claim this terrible faith is forever accompanied by death and calamity. Every large-scale plague, infectious disease, and supernatural event is related to us. But there's a saying, the enemy is our mirror. All the slander, defamation, and fear remind us that we must revere and be wary of the power we wield. Therefore, as a spellcaster, your first step must be to learn meditation. This is a precious legacy from ancient times. A special technique that helps spellcasters quickly master power without losing control. So the first step is to concentrate your consciousness and prevent it from wandering. Concentrate your consciousness, and prevent it from wandering. Anson frowned slightly, closed his eyes, and a sharp pain shot through his forehead. The image that appeared in his consciousness made everything in the surrounding darkness crystal clear. Although he was worried about the side effects of this superpower, there was probably no better way. Now he could concentrate completely, without even needing to open his eyes to read the contents of the letter. As his mind and body gradually calmed down, something strange began to happen in his previously empty sea of consciousness. Anson gradually discovered that the range of his consciousness was constantly expanding along with the range of what he could see, and that wasn't all. In previous attempts, Anson could only roughly estimate the range of what he could see, and there would be slight deviations as his attention shifted. But now he could judge distances with great precision, even having the illusion that everything was under his control. Lisa, yawning incessantly, patrolling vigilantly outside the tent, Carl, who had gotten up early and was handling the private's internal affairs with dark circles under his eyes, the new recruits who had just finished their guard duty and were now asleep in the trenches. Their expressions, demeanor, small movements, even the dirt under their feet, the cold wind blowing past their ears, the morning mist rising in the air, everything was clearly visible. It wasn't just seeing, it was almost as if it were within reach. Even the act of looking at the next line of the letter transformed from a necessary action into a simple thought. He wanted to know the content of the next line. It appeared directly in his mind without him even looking, no more, no less. Having completed the first step, you must have already discovered the terrifying nature of this power. The elegant, blood-red handwriting perfectly matched Anson's current thoughts. According to ancient texts, sorcery is a power that denies and alters reality. In ancient times, powerful sorcerers were often regarded as gods by believers, or as messengers who wielded some kind of natural power. This is, of course, nonsense, my dear believer. You have surely already discovered that the range you can control and sense is limited, and that is the range within which you can deny and alter. No matter how the methods vary, all sorcerers' power revolves around it. Within this range, you can arbitrarily deny and alter reality, accelerate time, make water burn, turn flames into flowing streams, and so, the following content comes into play. The text paused here, as if the dark mage hesitated about something. Of course, such immense power comes at a price. Firstly, the scope you can manipulate is extremely limited. Secondly, each spell requires prior preparation and has a usage limit. The principle is complex, because the preparation process for each spell is very lengthy. So early sorcerers devised a way to store prepared spells for later use. After reading the second line, Anson roughly understood the relationship between sorcerers and magic. In other words, for a sorcerer, magic is like a rifle loaded with ammunition. Even further, the rifle itself must be designed and manufactured. Casting a spell is instantaneous, but the preparation is extremely lengthy. One must first design the spell one wants to cast in one's mind, then refine it bit by bit according to the blueprint, and the scope of the design cannot exceed the range one can manipulate. For example, if one imagines a meteorite falling, the prerequisite is that the range one can manipulate must be large enough to encompass the entire sky. Or, if one wants to design a powerful 24-pound explosive bomb, the first prerequisite is that the caster himself won't be killed by the explosion. And as the design, or rather, the denial and alteration of reality, becomes more refined and complex, with more steps and layers, the time required increases. No wonder the dark mage reminds himself to pay attention to details. If one isn't careful when preparing spells, the outcome during casting will be disastrous. Considering that the ability to memorize ammunition reserves has an upper limit, this power does indeed have many limitations. But at the same time, the advantages are also terrifying. First and foremost, it allows for rapid practical application. Secondly, since magic can be memorized and prepared in advance, that means you don't actually need to prepare or even create a spell from scratch. As early as 550 BC, after the first spellcaster recorded his original spells, many spells have already been preserved in written form. They are mostly preserved in various secret or heavily guarded places, either destroyed by the Church of Order or hidden in historical documents, waiting to be discovered by future generations. And very fortunately, I happen to have such a spellbook of enchanted magic on hand, and now I formally hand it over to you. Dear fellow believer, all you need to do is follow the methods and steps recorded here, repeating the process step by step, and you will be able to smoothly complete the preparation and memorization of a spell. Another stroke of luck. If the dark mage were here now, he would probably be looking forward to seeing his shocked and grateful expression, right? Gradually calming himself down, Anson, sitting cross-legged on the spot, began to refocus his attention and, according to the method recorded on the letter, began to prepare his first spell as a spellcaster. 30 minutes later, a slight stabbing pain came from his chest, near his heart. As his supernatural power began to dissipate, Anson slowly opened his eyes, silently picked up the letter from the ground, and carefully folded it into the shape of a paper airplane. Lifting the tent flap, Anson saw Lisa asleep against the wall outside, a glistening drop of sweat clinging to her snoring lips. Anson, expressionless, followed his memory, transferring the spell he had just memorized onto the paper airplane in his hand. He breathed on it and gently tossed it towards the sleeping Lisa. The light paper airplane rose with a wind, and just before it hit the ground, it burst into flames without warning. Bang! A dazzling flash of fire streaked through the air, startling Lisa awake from her sweet dream. Looking at the scattering ashes and Lisa's dazed expression, Anson smiled genuinely. This is a very ancient spell, rumored to be a part of a powerful magic, scattered and lost over thousands of years, leaving only this last fragment, figuratively called by many spellcasters, gathering flame. Chapter 33 The Knight's Promise. On the 19th day of the siege, near the fortress of Thunder Castle, Ludwig stood motionless in the cold wind, leaning on his sword. Louis Bernard, bound in chains, stood beside him, while Roman tied up his horse in the distance. Gazing at the still-standing fortress, the slightly pale-faced young knight suddenly turned to look at Ludwig, a faint smile playing on his bloodless lips. "What are you laughing at?" Ludwig frowned slightly. Even for the sake of victory, this somewhat humiliating method still displeased him. "You didn't send Lord Anson, as my prisoner, shouldn't he be here?" Louis chuckled. "Or is it that the esteemed Brigadier General Ludwig Franz believes that doing so would allow his subordinates to steal his honor, so he has to hold the exchange ceremony in private?" "Sir Louis Bernard, you worry too much. I'm not so shameless as to steal my subordinates' honor." Facing the enemy's sarcasm, Ludwig snorted coldly. "Holding the exchange ceremony in private is also for the sake of your army. What will the imperial soldiers in the city think when they see their commander condoning the enemy for the sake of his own relatives? Besides, the agreed time was 6:30, and it's already almost 15 minutes past the appointed time. Does your elder brother, Lord Crow Bernard, heir to the Duchy of Adland, care so little about the life and death of his own brother?" "It seems so." Smiling, Louis didn't deny it at all, and didn't forget to retort sarcastically to Ludwig, "You value time so much because you're worried that the value of the prisoner will be reduced and you won't get what you want in return." Just as the two were exchanging barbs, a light clatter of hooves approached from afar, and a knight appeared amidst the morning mist of the wilderness. At the same time, the sharp-eyed Roman had already stepped forward, his right hand gripping the hilt of his lance, his eyes fixed on the rapidly approaching figure. The other man kept his promise, at least it seemed so, dismounting at close range and coming on foot, causing both Roman and Ludwig to breathe a slight sigh of relief. After all, the imperial cavalry was renowned, and the previous unannounced raid had left them both somewhat wary. If the other man had truly resorted to force, stopping dozens of cavalrymen from snatching someone in the wilderness would have been virtually impossible. "You're late," Ludwig said coldly, his breath slightly ragged, as he looked at the burly figure cloaked and carrying a greatsword. "Because you chose a hard-to-find place." Kroger Bernard, his voice deep and heavy, stopped about 10 paces away. "It took a little longer to get here, then, before the exchange ceremony begins, let's agree on our terms." Even though the other party was alone, Roman's serious tone still exuded a sense of pressure. "As agreed, we will return Sir Louis Bernard to you. You can see that we did not mistreat or torture your brother, and you can ask him yourself when we return to the camp. As the price for the return, from tomorrow until 3 days later, the Imperial army within the fortress must cease fire on the area outside the city and cannot launch any offensive actions, and to ensure that we both abide by the agreement, here is a contract for you." Roman was still speaking when Kroger's gaze had already fallen on Louis Bernard beside him, scrutinizing his smiling brother. "Then please sign here, and the exchange ceremony will be officially over." Roman, realizing he was being ignored, frowned slightly, suppressing his anger as he took out a written agreement and stepped forward to hand it to the other party. No need for such trouble. Kroger's cold gaze swept over Roman, causing him to stop a few steps away, before turning to Ludwig, whose face was equally etched with displeasure. Leave Louis behind, you leave, and I guarantee that for the next 3 days we won't bombard your rat's den, and the city's army won't come out in full force to wipe you out. It's that simple, really. Ludwig laughed angrily. Then may I ask, Your Excellency Kroger Bernard, how can we, these scum hiding in a rat's den, ensure that you won't launch a surprise attack and wipe us out when we retreat? You can't. Kroger's voice remained calm to the point of being somewhat brutal. So you are the scum hiding in a rat's den, and the only thing you can count on is my magnanimity, arrogance, and an undisguised threat. Ludwig and Roman's expressions changed simultaneously. Although they had roughly guessed from their previous conversations that the other party wouldn't be friendly, such a blatantly arrogant and insincere attitude still surprised them. Kroger Bernard, did he really not care about his own brother's life or death? Or was this guy so arrogant that he thought he could single-handedly snatch his brother away from the two of them unharmed? Either way, it wasn't good news. Ludwig gripped his sword hilt tightly. If that's the case, then we can't return Sir Louis Bernard to you, Ludwig said coldly. This kind of insincere behavior can't be called an agreement, Crow sneered. Is that so? Then how many days can your scum, who would run away after being hit by a couple of cannon shots, hold out outside Thunder Castle, until the fortress falls? Ludwig gritted his teeth. Hand Louis over to me. Kroger was growing impatient. For the sake of the Church of Order, Lord Ludwig Franz, I'll give you one more chance. The same words are returned to you, Lord Kroger Bernard. Negotiation is based on trust. If you show no sincerity whatsoever, then, Kroger suddenly stepped forward, his raised right hand gripping the hilt of the greatsword. The heavy blade transformed into a black shadow, crashing to the ground like a shrieking ghost. Clang, a deafening sound exploded in their ears. Startled, Ludwig and Roman simultaneously drew their guns, pointing them at each other. Halt, Roman shouted sharply, stepping forward to shield Ludwig behind him, his expression extremely grim. Kroger sneered, a slight grin spreading across his face, as he dragged the greatsword forward. This is the final warning, Roman threatened again, his forehead already covered in cold sweat. The only response was the black shadow of the greatsword hurtling towards him. Swoosh, a dazzling flash of light streaked across the face of the greatsword and saber as they clashed. Roman, using the momentum to dodge the fatal blow, cocked his sidearm's hammer with his left thumb. Bang! Almost instinctively, he tilted his head, allowing Crow to dodge a shot aimed at his head. Roman's pupils constricted, and he immediately drew his blade, lunging like a hyena's claws. Clang! Another clash of blades echoed as the force of the greatsword sent Roman flying. He could hear the groan of his right arm bones. Enduring the excruciating pain, he drew his gun again the instant they separated. Bang! 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 3 shots fired in quick succession. All missing their mark. The greatsword, still blurring its path, swept across, knocking the sidearm from Roman's hand. Watching the imposing figure rush towards him in an instant, Roman gritted his teeth. Thump! The greatsword crashed to the ground, kicking up clouds of dust that obscured their figures. Moments later, the dust settled. Roman stared at his opponent with a bewildered expression, breathing heavily without uttering a sound. Gripping Roman's right hand, which was holding a knife, Kroger glanced disdainfully at the military knife that had nearly cleaved his neck, a hyena-like fighting stance. I never expected to run into a Wild Hunt Night bloodline talent user. Tell me, scum, what's your relationship with the Walton family? Feeling the power emanating from his right hand, Roman's expression began to twist slightly. Not going to speak, Kroger's eyes narrowed to slits. It's alright, your blood will tell me the answer, brother Kroger. Stop, a timely shot stopped Kroger, who had already gripped the hilt of his sword. Taking a deep breath, Louis, his face serious, turned to Ludwig beside him. I made a promise to Anson Bach before I came here, so I hereby promise you, if my brother breaks today's agreement, then I will leave the fortress and join your army. This is my promise, a knight's promise, whether you believe it or not. With that, he left the astonished Ludwig behind and strode away. Chapter 34 The Pure White Dove. On the misty wilderness, with the backs of 2 imperial knights disappearing into the distance, Ludwig helped the wounded Roman walk towards the direction where the horse was tethered. This should do it, Ludwig muttered to himself, head bowed in thought. It seems Anson's judgment was correct. Louis Bernard is an easily influenced fellow who adheres to certain principles. Roman, supported by Ludwig, hunched over, his silent expression thoughtful. This was a somewhat desperate measure. The conscripted army, unilaterally attacked and facing a logistical crisis, had little leverage in negotiations except for hostages. Therefore, they could only hope the enemy would keep their promises. It wasn't hard to judge from various aspects that Crow valued his brother highly, so he shouldn't completely ignore Louis Bernard's demands. If there was a way to prolong the siege, perhaps there was still a sliver of hope, but the trouble was that both sides knew very well that the kingdom of Clovis dared not, and could not, continue to drag things out. With their logistics crippled, the conscription team had lost any leverage to delay the battle. As Crow had said, the only thing we can count on is his magnanimity. Humiliation, even recalling Crow's arrogance just moments before, a helpless rage swelled in Ludwig's chest. Clenching his teeth, he had never hated himself so much, hated why he hadn't had enough power. While Roman was being suppressed, he could do nothing but watch from the sidelines. If he hadn't insisted on joining the army, but instead accepted his father's arrangement to join the Judgment Knights, he could at least have. "What's wrong?" Noticing Roman suddenly stop beside him, Ludwig asked with concern. "Is it your wound?" "No," Roman quickly interrupted the brigadier general, his sharp eyes rising. "It's just, I feel like that Krog Bernard is a bit off. We only clashed once, and even though I tried my best to conceal it, he still saw through my bloodline power, which comes from the Wild Hunt Knight of the Walton family. That is also possible, isn't it?" Ludwig's expression turned serious as he hesitated and guessed. After all, the other party is a descendant of the Imperial Sea Knight Bernard family, and he certainly knows more about the Seven Knights bloodline than we Clovis people do. Moreover, not all gifted individuals can sense each other. Ludwig's expression suddenly changed. He remembered, among the direct descendants of the Bernard family in this generation, only Louis Bernard inherited the power of the Sea Knight bloodline. If that's the case, how did Crow discover Roman's bloodline power? No, more importantly, how could he, an ordinary person without bloodline power, completely suppress Roman, who possessed it, and even surpass him? As a close friend, Ludwig knew Roman's bloodline power all too well. Once activated, he would become almost berserk, requiring absolute rationality to suppress his destructive urges. In exchange, he would gain extraordinary agility, strength, and even instinctive combat intuition. But in the battle just now, Roman, the only one with bloodline power, was the one being suppressed. If Louis Bernard hadn't stopped him in time, it wouldn't have been just a matter of being suppressed. Roman's face was grim, but Crow's other words echoed in his mind. "Your blood will give me the answer." What did that mean? Could it be that the Imperial garrison inside Thunder Castle really was as he suspected? Stop thinking about it. All speculation is just speculation. Interrupting Roman's deep thought, Ludwig helped him onto his horse and mounted himself. "What the enemy does isn't important. What's important is doing our own job well. The messengers from the Privy Council and the army should be arriving soon. I'm heading back to the camp now. Roman, once you get back, go immediately to Anson Bach's position. Call that guy back, and then immediately lead the Grenadier Regiment to set off. You have 2 days to wipe out Oaktown." "Yes, sir." Watching Roman gallop away, Ludwig, confirming his close friend was mostly unharmed, breathed a slight sigh of relief. The image of another confidant began to surface in his mind. Anson Bach, that guy who always said everything is going according to plan, the one he'd never seen panic, must be anxiously awaiting news from his side in the camp right now, right? Ludwig was half right. Anson was indeed very nervous, but not about the outcome of the negotiations, which wasn't a problem for him at the moment. The biggest problem was the lack of supplies. For the conscripted troops stationed inland, logistics should have been the least of their concerns. The limited capacity of the steam trains was more than enough to support an army of several thousand. Now that the supply line was temporarily cut off, they finally realized that the supplies available from Oaktown and the surrounding area were completely insufficient to support the siege. Therefore, even to avoid a complete logistical disruption before the supply line was restored, Ludwig had to order a 1/3 reduction in supplies for the entire army. When the first soldier discovered that he was missing a loaf of bread, the existing rumors of Oaktown's fall immediately began to spread. Within just 1 day, there were 2 protests within the lines. Soldiers surrounded the supply depots, demanding adequate supplies. Although the commotion was quickly quelled without any casualties, it left many officers shaken and forced them to set an example by reducing their own supplies by a third. During the disturbance, Anson and his first platoon remained unusually quiet, although their supplies had also been cut. As a severely understaffed platoon, Ludwig had previously distributed supplies at full strength to set an example and establish a precedent. Using their accumulated supplies, Anson temporarily stabilized the morale of the first platoon, while simultaneously arousing envy among the soldiers of the surrounding regiments. Lisa August, carrying a rifle, began swaggering into the other regiment's positions, luring hungry soldiers to join her skirmish company with her own stockpiled canned meat. Karl Bain had offered her the exorbitant price of 1 can of meat per soldier to replenish her ranks as quickly as possible before the official start of the war. Driven by the canned food, the two managed to recruit nearly a dozen veterans from various infantry regiments, significantly bolstering the first platoon's combat strength, a piece of good news, at least. The only problem was the growing number of followers trailing behind Lisa. Anson felt his old story about a skirmisher company commander eating only 2 bowls of soup a day was about to be exposed. While supply reductions stabilized logistics, they also further dampened already unstable morale. Especially the severe shortage of rations, which fueled resentment among officers who had already given up hope for the siege. But there's always an exception. A pigeon. Anson watched as Lisa approached, rifle slung over her shoulder, a half-dead pigeon clutched in the other, gesturing smugly at him as if seeking praise. It should be a carrier pigeon from the Fortress Empire, Karl Bain said matter-of-factly, a cheap cigarette dangling from his lips, his throat barely perceptible. I saw it fly over Thunder Fortress and guessed it was probably a plea for help from the Empire, so I had Lisa shoot it down. Yes, Lisa shot it down. Lisa, smugly holding her rifle above her head, gestured enthusiastically while licking her dry lips. Did you find any intelligence, like a letter or something? Anson asked Karl, taking the presumably dead pigeon from Lisa. No, maybe it fell somewhere when it was shot down, we didn't notice, so this pigeon died rather unjustly. Looking at the innocent, pure white creature in his hands, which had been soaring freely in the blue sky as usual, yet had lost its life in a war unrelated to it, just like the former owner of this body. With a low sigh and a sorrowful expression, Anson looked at the two people behind him. So, how are we going to eat it? If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 35, a little interlude. Inside the fairly spacious tent, the 3 satisfied individuals simultaneously breathed a sigh of relief, wiping the sauce-covered corners of their mouths. Although the meat was a bit tough, and the sauce had only remained on the surface and hadn't penetrated at all, they had used a smokeless stove instead of an open flame to roast it. The taste of fresh meat was simply fantastic compared to the monotonous cured meat they ate every day. If there was anything to complain about, it was that a roasted pigeon was far too small for 3 people. It was barely enough to satisfy their cravings. After gnawing away even the bones, the 3, having rested briefly, began their respective tasks. Lisa, carrying a bag of canned goods, prepared to further expand her skirmisher company, or rather, to expand her canned goods storage, while Karl, as the battalion commander of the 1st Infantry Battalion and adjutant-in-chief, had to figure out how to assign positions and roles to the recruits Lisa had poached. There was also a minor incident. The regimental quartermaster, John S., had gone missing. This was a man with little presence. Anson's impression of him was limited to the day of the fortress defense, when Karl had mentioned his name. Furthermore, it was said that this quartermaster had come with Commander Willen Small, so few people paid him any attention. The key was the timing of his disappearance, which coincided precisely with the period before and after the cavalry raid, the very days when the Black Mage was forced to meet with Anson. This was quite intriguing. In an infantry regiment, the quartermaster was a position of moderate importance, managing daily affairs, food, lodging, and even finances. Theoretically, in peacetime, he could be anywhere on the front lines. In other words, the Black Mage was very likely using the identity of quartermaster to hide nearby, constantly monitoring him, until the Imperial cavalry launched their raid, and he realized something was wrong, then escaped from the siege amidst the chaos. Considering the timing of the letter, this wasn't impossible. Furthermore, The fact that the former Anson remembered his former history professor, yet he himself had never recognized the quartermaster's appearance, suggested that this black mage might possess some form of disguise. If that's the case, then it fits the secret-seeking attribute of dark magic quite well, and is very likely one of the spells the other party possesses. With such an easily concealed identity, coupled with the inherent skill in secret-seeking dark magic, it's no wonder he was completely unaware of the dark mage before. Even when the other party was forced to reveal his whereabouts for the last time, he still couldn't catch him. Alone in the tent, Anson pondered, trying to calm himself, and began preparing his memory spell. Following the advice the dark mage had given him, a qualified spellcaster should be like a line soldier with his rifle, constantly preparing his next spell. Although he currently only possessed one spell, and it was more like a trick than magic, Gathering Flame, it allowed Anson to imprint magic onto anything within his controllable range, causing it to ignite spontaneously after 3 to 5 seconds, though, in Anson's view, it was actually closer to a small-scale explosion. If the item is inherently flammable, such as letter paper or dry firewood, it will ignite after the spell is successfully cast. However, if it's not naturally flammable, it will likely only melt or become hot. The magic used to imprint the spell will gradually dissipate over time. Anson conducted a comparative experiment. The letter paper that had just been enchanted was instantly burned to ashes. After being left to stand for 5 minutes, only a few burn marks remained on the edges. Overall, it's a matchstick-like, practical but not very powerful spell, probably a basic beginner's level. Anson guessed that once he became more proficient, he might be able to make the spell more powerful. But even this seemingly insignificant little spell required him to spend nearly 30 minutes preparing, and each time it gave him a splitting headache and his heart felt like it was about to explode. Furthermore, the range of the spell absolutely could not exceed the limit of his controllable distance. After several tests, Anson could basically determine that the range was all corners within a radius of 20 meters centered on himself. Beyond this range, the magic would instantly fail. Could such a simple, almost magical spell, coupled with himself as a novice spellcaster, really stop the old gods faction within the fortress? Even with the most meticulous planning, Anson couldn't help but feel a pang of pessimism. Just as he finished memorizing the first spell and was preparing to continue, a slightly hurried series of footsteps sounded outside the tent. Quickly reacting, Anson immediately stood up, casually picked up a piece of paper from the table, and began to ponder. A dozen seconds later, an uninvited figure barged into the tent. Anson's lips twitched slightly as he caught sight of the person out of the corner of his eye. It was indeed Roman. But when he turned to look at the other man, he couldn't help but show a look of surprise. "You're injured, none of your business," Roman said coldly, his voice slightly weak. "I'm here to relay the Brigadier General's orders. Report to the tent in 15 minutes and explain your next plan to the General, if you really have a plan." His gaze casually glanced at the blank letter on the table. The atmosphere in the tent became somewhat awkward. "Understood, I'll get right away. I'm ordered to immediately lead the Grenadier Regiment to Oaktown, quell the rebellion within 2 days, and repair the train tracks damaged by the Imperial Cavalry." Roman, his expression grim, interrupted Anson. "Based on my understanding of the Admiral, this means I might not make it in time for the upcoming siege of Thunder Castle. So whatever you're planning, listen carefully. There's something wrong with the Imperial garrison in Thunder Castle, especially their commander, Crow Bernard. You must be extremely wary of this man, not just his tactics, but also his personal strength. Right now, I have no evidence, and it might all just be my imagination. Crow Bernard, or rather, the Imperial garrison in the city, might be connected to the old gods." The old gods? Anson, slightly startled, desperately resisted the urge to reach for his sidearm behind his back. Anyone who graduates from a church academy should know something about the old gods. "You don't need to pretend with me." Roman spoke each word carefully, his voice slightly breathless. "In short, I must remind you, no matter how perfect your plan is, you must consider one thing. This Battle of Thunder Castle could very well be an enemy trap." With that, he left the still shocked Anson and turned to walk out of the tent. But just as he was about to leave, Roman suddenly stopped and turned back. "Oh, right, there's one more thing," he said, pulling a small cylinder from his jacket pocket. "It's a letter. I won't tell you the contents to keep it a secret, but it's basically the Brigadier General requesting reinforcements from the Southern Legion." Anson nodded, not quite understanding. "And then, to ensure safety, they didn't send cavalry, but instead prepared a carrier pigeon. It happened about an hour ago." Roman held up the small cylinder, his tone slightly puzzled. "But on my way here, I found it nearby, so I wanted to ask if you've noticed anything, Anson." Chapter 36 The Bernard Bloodline. On the way back to Thunder Castle, an anxious Louis Bernard kept a close eye on his brother Crow's expression. He knew all too well how much trouble he had gotten into, disobeying orders, being captured, making promises to the enemy, and going against his brother's plans, especially the latter two, which he had done right in front of him. But strangely, Crow didn't reprimand him as harshly as he expected, or even give him a meaningful look. He remained silent the entire way, except for a few necessary times, which only made Louis more nervous. This tension continued until the two returned to the fortress. Crow, after leading the young knight to his room, dismissed the guards outside the door and only closed the door after confirming twice that everything was all right. Watching the guards' departing backs, Louis took a deep breath, stood ramrod straight, and placed his hands behind his back, bracing himself for his brother's storm of reprimands. "You leave Thunder Castle Fortress immediately, tonight," Crow said coldly to Louis, his back to the door. "Huh?" Louis looked blankly at his stern-faced brother. "Brother, but, don't worry, I've already arranged everything for you." Kroger ignored Louis's attempt to speak and continued without stopping, "You will stay here from now until midnight tonight. I've arranged for 2 cavalrymen to provide backup. Just follow along, and let them handle any questions that come their way. Once you leave Thunder Fortress, immediately head in the opposite direction from the siege lines. Try to avoid important cities and towns along the way. You'll be safe once you reach the border. I've already drafted a letter for the commander of the Southern Legion, so no one will bother you. Once you arrive, take the letter directly to Brother Kroger." Louis, looking shocked, suddenly shouted sharply. Kroger, interrupted, suddenly shifted his expression and silently watched his younger brother. "What happened? Why do you suddenly want me to leave?" Louis asked, puzzled. "Is it because I disobeyed your orders, or because my actions ruined your plans? You could have told me. You didn't have to just send me back without a word." Louis's slightly aggrieved voice echoed in the spacious room. A moment later, Kroger suddenly stepped forward, put his hand on Louis's shoulder, and forcefully made him sit on the edge of the bed. He then knelt down on one knee, looking directly into Louis's clear and innocent eyes. "Brother, no." "Louis, listen to me," Kroger interrupted with a sigh, gently patting his younger brother's shoulder. "I'm not doing this because you made a mistake and I'm sending you back. I'm doing this for the future of the Bernard family, for the future of the Bernard family. No matter what happens, you cannot have any further involvement in the siege of Thunder Fortress." Kroger's expression was extremely stern. "It's not your war, and you can't gain any merit or honor from it. For the sake of the Bernard family, the only thing you, Louis Bernard, the inheritor of the Sea Knight bloodline, can do right now is leave this place, and the farther away the better. I'll repeat myself, this isn't about protecting you, but about the future of the Bernard family. For the future of the Bernard family, your and my personal dignity and honor are irrelevant. Understand?" Looking at his suddenly serious brother, Louis's inner questions remained unanswered, leaving him even more confused. But he knew this wasn't the time to ask, and simply nodded blankly. "Okay. I understand." Kroger nodded slightly, a hint of relief appearing on his stern face. "You know, when we were young, I was jealous of you." Slowly rising, Kroger sat beside Louis, his hand on Louis's shoulder, looking down into the eyes that gazed up at him. "When Father told me regretfully that you were the only one among our generation capable of becoming a gifted individual, though I pretended to be magnanimous, I was probably the one most jealous of you of all." Looking at his brother's expression, Louis could hardly believe his ears. The heir to the Duchy of Edland, his own brother, was jealous of him? "Yes, you heard me right." Kroger slowly withdrew his gaze. "It's hard for a knight like you, Louis, untainted by this world, to understand what it means for the heir to a duchy to not inherit the power of the family's bloodline. For me at the time, it meant a lot. The gazes of other families, the criticism from my mother and relatives. I hate speaking ill of others behind their backs, but many people did tell me that you would be the biggest obstacle to my future inheritance of the title. Unfortunately, I thought so too at the time. I was too impulsive and too easily swayed. Those years when your bloodline power awakened were probably the most difficult time for me. I made many decisions that I still regret to this day, and that I can't undo. Of all those decisions, there is only one I don't regret to this day, and that is that I didn't hurt my brother." Louis Bernard was completely stunned. Looking at his brother, who was so abnormal and completely different from the always serious, calm, an occasionally irritable figure in his memory, he vaguely sensed that something was wrong, but dared not speak. The world is quietly changing. Something hidden in the shadows is sprouting, and some unwilling to submit are trying to change something. But no matter how the world changes, we will always belong to the Bernard family bloodline. Only now do I understand how right my decision was. Louis, we are blood relatives, but more importantly, we are members of the Bernard family. Each of us should continue this glorious name for 1,000 years in our own way. You have your own path, and the only thing I can do for you is to let you steadfastly follow that path, and keep going. Crow stood up and gently patted his brother's shoulder. So don't worry, I don't think there was anything wrong with your previous actions. On the contrary, you were fulfilling a knight's promise with your actions, and that's not wrong, because of your actions. The Clovis will remember the promise of a Bernard knight even more deeply, and how much weight it will carry. After saying this, he solemnly looked at Louis, turned, and walked towards the door. Watching his brother's departing figure, Louis, who had remained silent, suddenly stood up and reached out to try and stop him. Kroger's words gave him a very strong premonition. If he couldn't stop his brother here, perhaps he would never. Oh, right, Kroger, with his back to Louis, suddenly stopped, his right hand reaching for the doorknob. Regarding the agreement with the Clovis, you can rest assured, I will keep my promise and won't do anything to those scum within 3 days. Also, if you have the chance to see them, remember to say hello to our cutest little sister for me. With that, Kroger slammed the door and left. In the empty house, only Louis remained, his hand outstretched, staring blankly out the door. Chapter 37 Layout. To capture the fortress, we absolutely cannot fight during the day. Facing Ludwig and a group of conscripted officers, Anson, standing before the sand table of Remingberg, began his speech with a statement. Although, according to the brigadier general, this was merely an informal military meeting, its purpose simply to reach a consensus throughout the army, and far from finalizing a battle plan, all the officers present, including Ludwig himself, knew very well that this was the final mobilization before the war. The Remingberg conscripts, with their supply lines cut off, had no more time for thorough preparation. According to the intelligence we have now, the garrison inside the fortress currently consists of 300 elite Imperial cavalry, approximately 2 to 3 full-strength infantry and artillery regiments, more than 50 light and heavy cannons, and a cavalry officer regiment of less than 30 men. As he spoke, Anson drew his bayonet from its sheath and pointed to the model of Thunder Fortress marked on the sand table. Therefore, without considering the possibility of reinforcements, we can temporarily assume that the enemy force is around 2,000. Ludwig, with his hands resting on the table, stared silently at the location of Thunder Fortress, making it impossible to discern his thoughts. In contrast, our forces are nearly 3 times the size of the defenders at Thunder Fortress. Anson looked at the men before him, moving his right bayonet to the position of the besieging position. We have 6 understrength private regiments, a full-strength grenadier regiment, 14 light and heavy artillery pieces, and a full-strength cavalry company, totaling nearly 6,000 men. However, first, the private regiment stationed in Oaktown was completely annihilated by the unaccounted-for Imperial cavalry. At the same time, our most combat-effective grenadier regiment, led by Lieutenant Colonel Roman, went to Oaktown to stabilize order and restore supply lines. Therefore, our current actual strength is only around 5,000, barely more than double that of the defenders. If this disparity in strength were to lead to a direct confrontation, facing a defender with artillery superiority and the cover of the city walls, our army would be at a significant disadvantage. It is foreseeable that within the first 30 minutes of the battle, casualties would reach a quarter or even a third, and morale would completely collapse. Hearing this, many officers already showed pessimistic expressions. Therefore, since launching an attack during the day is almost impossible to capture Thunder Fortress and will inevitably result in heavy casualties, Anson took a deep breath, his mind racing. So, why don't we move the attack to the night? The officers exchanged glances. A night attack? That's easy to say. One of the officers sitting beside the sand table stood up and sneered at Anson. Right now, the army's morale has already been severely damaged by the lack of supplies. If we let the soldiers launch an attack in the freezing cold at midnight, precisely because morale is already at its lowest point, that's why we should change the attack time from day to night, Anson interrupted bluntly. No matter how cold it is at midnight in Thunder Fortress, it's better than sitting by a fire next to the blast site. Then what about the direction of attack? The officer, his face flushed, pressed on. The weather has been terrible these past few days. At night, not only is it windy, but the moon is also rarely visible. How are we supposed to determine the direction of attack in the pitch black of the battlefield? The sound of artillery fire. Anson, having seized control again, slammed his right bayonet onto the location of the artillery position on the sand table. Once the battle begins, the artillery positions will be responsible for blasting open the gates of Thunderberg with artillery. As long as you all still have your ears, it won't be difficult to figure out which direction the attack is. Anything else you want to ask? Silence fell in the tent as Anson's gaze swept over them. Only the officer who had been silenced twice by Anson looked pale, his eyes still showing some resentment. No one sitting there was a fool. Everyone understood that although Anson Bach was presiding over the military council, his presence meant that Brigadier General Ludwig had already made his decision. The rest was just a matter of everyone's attitude, and incidentally reaching a consensus. The quiet tent was so quiet that even the howling of the cold wind outside could be heard. One last question. The officer, his face ashen, spoke again, still unwilling to give up. If we choose to attack at midnight, how can you guarantee that the Imperial garrison inside the fortress won't fire before our attack? It's nighttime, after all. What if the shells hit our main attack direction? That's not up for discussion. This time, it was Ludwig, who had remained silent, who raised his hand to stop him. I can assure you all that the enemy inside the fortress will not make any move before our attack officially begins. As soon as he finished speaking, Anson, standing at the other end of the sand table, nodded slightly in agreement. Huh? All the officers present were stunned as their gazes simultaneously turned to the two men with confident expressions. They knew that the greatest threat to the conscripted army was the unpredictable shelling of Thunder Fortress. Clearly, the Imperial garrison inside wasn't stupid or blind. As soon as they detected any movement on the besieged positions, they would fire at their designated targets. The greatest threat of this targeted artillery bombardment wasn't casualties, but a blow to morale, preventing the besieging forces from easily assembling their troops. This was precisely why the advance of the siege became incredibly slow. Now Ludwig was actually telling them that the Imperial garrison would remain silent until the conscripted army made its move. But since this was Ludwig's decision, the others had nothing to say. After all, they wouldn't be the ones to take the blame if the siege failed. Ludwig, stared by pairs of eyes filled with astonishment and confusion, kept his attention on Anson. Only now did he finally understand the man's entire plan. Using trenches to advance the position was to shorten the distance of the attack and lower the guard of the city's defenders. Returning the prisoners, deliberately saying it would take 3 days, made them mistakenly believe the conscripted army intended to use those 3 days to accelerate the fortifications and launch an attack on the 4th day. But his real purpose was merely to gain the upper hand. As long as the fortress defenders don't immediately suppress the enemy lines with artillery during the final assault, the vanguard can quickly advance past the front 200 meters and enter the blind spot of the heavy artillery, thus negating the enemy's greatest advantage. Despite encountering cavalry raids, setbacks in the advance, and the disruption of supply lines, Anson Bach, this guy is still ensuring the entire battle proceeds according to his preset plan. He can win, he really can win. Ludwig, desperately suppressing his excitement, looks at Anson with increasing fervor. Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, continue with your plan. Okay, Anson hesitates, his eyes flickering, feeling a little uneasy under Ludwig's gaze. What did I just say to make him so excited? First, our army must be divided into 3 parts. 4 infantry regiments will assemble at the 2 forward artillery positions, while the remaining troops and cavalry will be responsible for defending the artillery positions. The battle should begin around 1 a.m. The 2 forward infantry regiments will launch an assault, followed by continuous bombardment of the city gate from the artillery positions, assisting the other 2 artillery positions in providing fire suppression and cover towards the main gate. Boom! Just as Anson finished speaking, a sudden, deafening explosion came from outside the tent. The expressions of everyone inside the tent changed drastically. The atmosphere became tense. Anson, raising an eyebrow, casually tossed his bayonet onto the sand table and stepped out of the tent. Almost simultaneously with him lifting the curtain, another thunderous explosion occurred. Boom! A ghastly white light exploded in the cloud-covered sky. Anson instinctively looked up at the sky, and a tiny drop of water hit his cheek. In the blink of an eye, the droplet began to drizzle, spreading across the sky. It was raining. Chapter 38. By what right? The torrential rain that began at dawn showed no sign of abating by evening, and in fact, it seemed to be intensifying. At dinner time, The downpour continued. Orderly soldiers carrying meal boxes entered the tents and placed the food directly on the tables in front of each person. Inside the silent tents, the officers, already ravenously hungry, swallowed hard, glancing at the delicious food on their plates out of the corner of their eyes, but no one dared to touch it. All eyes were tensely fixed on the silent Ludwig, as the scalding soup slowly cooled. Ludwig Franz was in a terrible mood. Terribly terrible. He had given almost everything for this battle, grasping at every straw, seizing every opportunity, even willing to endure the enemy's humiliation, but he hadn't anticipated the weather. In winter, Thunderberg didn't have the falling snow, but it had biting, icy rain. A downpour, and a winter downpour at that. The morale of an army preparing for an attack was unprecedentedly devastating. Thousands of soldiers stood in trenches flooded by rain, struggling to pull themselves out of the mud while trying to keep their pistols and ammunition boxes dry. Next, they had to assemble in the downpour and launch a charge through the waterlogged mud, dragging their soaked bodies forward. In the torrential rain, the battlefield would be devoid of any landmarks to indicate their direction of attack, except for fleeting artillery fire and the silhouettes of their comrades. They would receive no further instructions beyond the order to attack. Furthermore, the rain would obscure the aim of all artillery, forcing them to fire from pre-combat markings, while also being prepared to risk friendly fire. And they faced Imperial soldiers huddled in the fortress, their bodies and clothes dry and clean, their strength abundant, and their combat experience plentiful, a force whose morale would likely be maintained until their commanders were killed. Thinking of all this, Ludwig could easily foresee the upcoming battle and the fate that awaited him and his Reiamberg conscripts. A crushing defeat, it seemed inevitable the moment the torrential rain began to fall. Ludwig, chilled to the bone, clenched his fists, his weary gaze suddenly stopping as he looked up. At the far end of his vision, on the other side of the sand table, the figure was enjoying his dinner as if nothing had happened. Although logistics were strained, each officer had been provided with steaming hot vegetable and meat soup, freshly baked bread sprinkled with salt and pepper, a glass of wine, a small piece of cheese, and 2 garlic sausages. Anson, holding his glass, downed the slightly sour wine in one gulp, then carefully broke off a piece of bread, piling the crumbs and all onto the soup bowl before forking a garlic sausage between the 2 pieces and taking a large bite. Ludwig was stunned. Anson Bach, this guy, he's giving up on himself? The officers who noticed the brigadier general's expression turned their gazes to the other end of the sand table, then stared in disbelief. The tent was deathly silent, save for the sound of the rain outside and Anson enjoying his dinner. A full minute later, as if recovering from his shock, Ludwig silently picked up his glass. The officers who saw the brigadier general's action seemed to have a switch flipped, and they too began to eat in silence. Just then, a young sergeant, soaking wet, suddenly burst into the tent, carrying a small backpack for letters. Ludwig stopped the guard, silently rose, and walked to the young sergeant, taking the letter from his hand. The moment he opened the letter, Ludwig's hand suddenly trembled and then abruptly stopped, the force so strong that it startled the young sergeant, who thought the brigadier general was going to tear the letter up. He stood there for a moment, then said without looking up, "Good work, you can go now." "Yes, sir." The young sergeant, his face wet with rain and sweat, jolted, hurriedly saluted the brigadier general, and quickly left. Turning around, Ludwig, expressionless, pursed his lips, his gaze sweeping over the anxious faces besides Anson's. Everyone, except Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, out, immediately. "Yes, sir," all the officers answered in unison, leaving behind their messy plates, and disappeared from the tent in an orderly fashion. 15 seconds later, only Ludwig, hands behind his back, and Anson, still eating dinner, remained before the sand table. Only after swallowing the last piece of bread and letting out a long sigh did Anson raise his gaze to Ludwig, who remained standing there, silent. "Bad news, an order from the Privy Council." Ludwig paused, his whole body trembling slightly as he spoke. "The order is for me to lead the army out of Thunderberg within 2 days, to do everything in my power to maintain and restore order in Oaktown, to repair the train tracks as quickly as possible, and to ensure unimpeded traffic in the surrounding area." The implication was that Ludwig was to abandon the siege of Thunderberg, essentially a peaceful dismissal. Anson nodded slightly. "And then, what about Thunderberg?" "I don't know. They'll probably really have to bring in a gunner with experience from the Western Front." Ludwig was unusually calm, even a little unsettling, saying lightly, "The letter didn't mention the siege forces." "How It seems they really want to drive me out of the battlefield completely. The army, Anson murmured. No, this time it wasn't the army's doing. For the first time, Ludwig smiled at Anson, his lips twitching stiffly. It was my father, the Archbishop of the Order Church of the Kingdom of Clovis, the illustrious Luther Franz. He personally wrote to the Privy Council, requesting the swift capture of Thunderberg and the reopening of the supply line to the southern fortress. It was because of him that this letter reached me so quickly. Instead of 2 days later, thanks to my meticulous and cautious father, I had the opportunity to retreat with some dignity, instead of being forced to leave the siege ground under the reprimands of the Privy Council's envoy. With that, the smiling Ludwig closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and braced his right hand against the corner of the table. When he opened his eyes again, Anson, hands behind his back, was already standing before him. And you, what? Ludwig was startled. I'm asking you, Brigadier General Ludwig, Anson said calmly. Are you prepared to roll out of the siege? I'm not ready. In the plan I gave you, I didn't include any retreat plan. That was a mistake. Anson stepped forward, close to Ludwig's face. But I'm prepared to retake Thunderberg from the Empire, but we don't have time. Ludwig's expression tightened instantly. The Privy Council's order is for 2 days from now. If we can't, Anson interrupted again. Then we'll take Thunderberg tonight. Ludwig, his voice trembling, stared at Anson in disbelief, veins bulging on his forehead. Are you crazy, to attack a well-prepared fortress in this heavy rain during winter? No, General, I'm very calm. Anson shook his head, speaking calmly. Because of the torrential rain, the enemy will never believe we can launch an attack at this time, so we're attacking a fortress that's completely unprepared and whose visibility is completely blocked. Ludwig was momentarily speechless. Yes, the torrential rain affects both sides equally. The defenders inside the city will also unconsciously lower their guard in such terrible weather. Given that, why withdraw from this battle to which we've poured everything when there's still hope of victory? Why hand over a fortress that we've besieged for over 10 days and is about to fall to some scum sent by the army? Why? Chapter 39 Lisa's Comfort. It took Ludwig several minutes to calm himself down. He sighed. Tell me, how many? Never mind, what else do you need now? He had originally intended to ask, how confident are you, but realized it was foolish to ask now. It would only shake his already dwindling confidence. Only one, Anson said softly. Launching an attack in the pouring rain at midnight is essentially gambling. Since it's gambling, let's bet everything at once. After a moment's thought, Ludwig spoke. You mean, call the Grenadier Regiment back now? He hesitated, not out of reluctance, but because suddenly turning back an army that might have covered half the distance in the pouring rain, forcing them to march back the way they came, was incredibly difficult. Moreover, the safety of Oaktown was crucial. If they captured Thunderberg but lost Oaktown, it wouldn't be a victory for the conscripted army or Ludwig himself. The sooner the better, even if only a battalion or a company returns. Anson nodded. Once the vanguard breaches the fortress gates, the ensuing battle will be close quarters combat, a meat grinder of hand-to-hand fighting and chaotic melee. Morale is crucial in this kind of battle. A single artillery barrage or a sudden reinforcement can drastically reverse the morale of both sides. As for Oaktown, there's no need to worry. Since the enemy chose to burn and loot, it proves their forces are completely insufficient to occupy and control the entire town. Otherwise, Oaktown would have fallen long ago. Send a light cavalryman immediately with a message. I believe Lieutenant Colonel Roman, upon receiving the news, will know better than I which is more important, Thunder Fortress or Oaktown. Ludwig hesitated for a moment, then a resolute expression appeared on his face. All right, I'll send someone right away. Hopefully, they can make it in time. As for you, Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach, you immediately proceed to the forward artillery positions and have the 1st Corps assemble, awaiting the order to attack. Anson immediately put his left hand behind his back, clenched his right fist, and pounded it against his chest. Yes, just as Anson was about to leave, Ludwig suddenly raised his hand to stop him. Wait a minute. Anson immediately turned around, but his heart was filled with trepidation. This Archbishop's own son, had he suddenly chickened out again? He paused, took a deep breath, and then looked at Anson. Take out your pocket watch and let me see it. Taking the old brass pocket watch that Anson handed over, Ludwig skillfully pressed open the cover, and at the same time took out his own enamel pocket watch. After comparing the two, he nodded slightly and returned the brass pocket watch to Anson. Although it's badly worn, The time is the same. It seems you've taken excellent care of it. You don't need to adjust the time anymore. Feeling a little guilty, Anson put the pocket watch back into his coat pocket. 1 o'clock in the morning, Ludwig looked at Anson with unwavering determination. Remember, launch the general offensive at 1 o'clock in the morning. The artillery positions will fire at 1:15 at the main gate of Thunder Fortress, at 2 rounds per minute for 10 minutes. If the gate is not breached after 10 minutes, or if the Imperial Army resists, I will storm the main gate and open a breach, Anson whispered. Ludwig, interrupted, pondered for a moment. Then suddenly smiled and said in an extremely relaxed tone, speaking of which, today is the last day of Saints calendar year 99. It's 5 o'clock in the afternoon now, and in 8 hours it will be Saints calendar year 100, go, Lieutenant Colonel Anson Bach. Tonight's New Year's salute will be exceptionally grand. Without wasting any more time, Anson left the tent and headed straight for the frontline artillery positions. Outside the tent, the siege positions, eroded by torrential rain in just a few hours, had already turned into a swamp. In knee-deep mud, soldiers huddled under cover, carefully protecting their weapons, their thin uniforms soaked through, shivering. The relentless downpour had even caused flooding in several low-lying positions. Soldiers unwilling to drown were forced to crawl out of their trenches, braving the rain and the risk of artillery fire to pitch their tents on the muddy ground, only to be repeatedly blown over by the howling wind. Several companies attempted to dig drainage ditches near the trenches as a last resort, but once the torrential rain turned their excavations into mud pits, no one dared to try again. Behind Anson, rushing towards the front lines, followed several unfortunate men driven out by officers to deliver rations to their respective companies. Their bodies were draped with large and small lunch boxes, and they carried 2 containers of hot soup, struggling arduously through the mud and rain. Even if he could safely bring all the rations back to camp, the steaming soup would probably be cold by now, and who knows how much rainwater and mud would have mixed in. When Anson arrived at the position, the situation was slightly better than he had expected. Although the forward positions right next to the artillery forts were also showing signs of flooding, the water level was only knee-deep. A company whose encampment had been flooded had been reassigned by Karl Bain to the higher artillery fort positions. Inside the tent, which was filled with steam, Karl Bain, with a cigarette dangling from his lips, frowned and tried to light a match that had been soaked in rainwater. Lisa, taking advantage of his inattention, quietly stole a can of food from behind Karl. Frustrated by several failed attempts, Karl tossed away the matches. He glanced up and saw Anson, soaked to the bone, and paused, slightly startled. What happened? Anson, still dripping wet, sighed. Notify the entire 1st platoon to assemble at the artillery position in half an hour. Immediately, staring at Anson's expression, Karl hesitated for a long time before tentatively asking, immediately. Receiving confirmation, Karl asked no more questions. He lit a cheap cigarette in the brazier, lowered his head, and took a few deep drags. The not-so-spacious tent quickly filled with smoke. Just as Lisa, coughing incessantly, was about to retaliate, Karl suddenly stood up, stomped out the still-burning cigarette, put his hands in his military coat pockets, and calmly left the tent. Before leaving, he tossed the remaining large bag of canned food on the table into Lisa's lap. Only Anson, desperately trying to remain calm, and Lisa, completely bewildered, stood before the warm brazier. The pattering rain made the momentary tranquility all the more peaceful. Sitting by the brazier, Anson stared at the flickering flames. He had hoped the cold rain would soothe his nerves, but now he felt unbearably hot. He pulled out his pocket watch, opened the cover, and his deep brown eyes, devoid of any expression, stared intently at the slowly moving hands. Lisa, beside him, stared blankly, as quiet as a ragdoll cat curled up in a corner. Suddenly, the pocket watch was snatched from Anson's mind, and a full bottle of rum was shoved into his empty right hand. Huh? Before he could recover from his shock, the once docile ragdoll cat was already standing in front of him, grabbing his right hand and shoving the bottle into his mouth. The icy liquor rushed down Anson's throat like a bolt of fire. You, cough. Lisa, her expression serious, gripped the bottle tightly until she was sure it was completely empty before letting go. Then, she looked at Anson, who was curled up and coughing violently, with great concern. Feeling better, what? Anson, who had almost choked to death, clutched his chest and looked at her in confusion. You look just as scared as Lisa did when she came here. Lisa stared wide-eyed at Anson, looking at him with an air of self-assurance. But once you've filled your stomach, you won't be scared anymore. Oh, I see. She's worried about me. Anson smiled, a warmth spreading through him. He looked curiously at the bag in her arms. In that case, why don't you share 2 of your cans with me? Lisa suddenly took 2 steps back, hiding the bag of cans behind her back, and stared at him warily. Don't even think about it, Anson. Chapter 40 Declaration in the Downpour. A pale flash of lightning, accompanied by a deafening roar, ripped through the night sky above Thunderberg. On the siege front at midnight, the torrential rain continued unabated. Thousands of soldiers, to the rhythmic beat of drums, waded through knee-deep mud and began to be mobilized. General mobilization. The Thunderberg conscript, consisting of 5 regiments plus artillery and cavalry companies, divided into 2 columns, entered their positions according to the most recent military deployment, preparing for a general assault on Thunderberg at 1 a.m. the following day. When the conscript officers received the news from the messengers, they could hardly believe their ears. After repeatedly confirming that it was Brigadier General Ludwig's order and not some New Year's joke, they frantically ran to gather their officers and quickly assemble their troops. Rifles slung across their backs, bayonets and ammunition hanging at their waists clattered and scraped together in the crowded ranks. The forest of flags, soaked through by the torrential rain, hung listlessly from their poles. No matter how the captains and sergeants shouted and cursed, even resorting to beatings with batons, the soldiers, clad in their drenched uniforms and having only drunk a bowl of cold broth, shivered in the cold wind, their spirits suddenly broken. Faced with this atmosphere, the officers, already lacking confidence in the raid, saw no hope of victory whatsoever. If it weren't for the example of someone executed, no one would dare disobey orders. They were even contemplating desertion. Even though many of them had only learned to line up for executions and eat with knives and forks at military academy, they knew that night combat was an extremely complex operation with a significant element of luck. Such a hasty decision, especially in such terrible weather, perhaps even driven by a sense of defiance, looked like a suicide mission. The only saving grace was that, just as Brigadier General Ludwig had said, the Imperial garrison at Thunderberg was completely oblivious to the commotion outside the city. Though with the rain pouring down, they probably had no idea what was happening outside. Inside the artillery position, a slightly tipsy Anson stood beside a 12-pounder, head bowed, intently watching his pocket watch, silently counting down in his mind. Click, click, click. The rain-drenched watch face had passed 12, finally beginning its next cycle. Boom, boom, boom. Suddenly, the sound of synchronized footsteps replaced the ticking of the clock, striking his heart. 1st Battle Infantry Regiment, 4 columns, attack formation, assemble. Carl Bain's shout rang in his ears, pulling Anson back to reality. Inside the artillery position was the 1st column, numbering nearly 400 men, and on the forward positions on both flanks of the artillery position, 3 more column infantry regiments followed closely behind. This differed slightly from Anson's initial plan, as the Grenadier Regiment and Lieutenant Colonel Roman had been transferred to Oaktown, losing a force capable of leading the attack. In the torrential rain, the Imperial defenders, sensing movement at the besieged positions, would undoubtedly fire blindly. Adding a new direction of attack without maintaining morale would only give the inaccurate artillery more experience. Therefore, even if Lieutenant Colonel Roman could return to the battlefield in time, he himself would be leading the attack. Ludwig Franz, who had invested heavily in himself, had been waiting for this moment. Carl Bain, holding a loaded Leopold rifle, walked solemnly to Anson. Although I've thought about it for a long time, I still feel that you're just sending us to our deaths, and taking us all with you, but this is the best way to save as many people as possible. Taking the rifle from Carl, Anson smiled and looked at his adjutant. Trust me, consider this the last time. Carl, with a complicated expression, snorted softly and let out a long breath. I'll ask you one last time, how confident are you? Or to put it another way, was this battle forced by that archbishop's son, or was it your own overconfidence and spur-of-the-moment decision? Anson, who was about to speak, suddenly noticed the gaze behind Carl and froze. More than 400 pairs of eyes from the 1st Regiment were staring at him in a daze. Lisa, standing in the first rank, carrying a rifle taller than herself, stared with her large eyes, which shone brightly even in the rainy night, and nervously watched his expression as he stood on tiptoe. At some point, the entire front line fell silent, so silent that only the sound of rain falling from the sky could be heard, and only pairs of bright eyes could be seen in the rain. After a moment of stunned silence, Anson took a deep breath, straightened his chest, and roared with all his might, "I have it. I'm confident I can win. What about you?" His shouts, piercing through the rain, seemed to freeze the air. Stunned, Carl Bain stared blankly at Anson, whose expression had suddenly changed. After a long pause, he managed a weak smile. Don't ask us, it wasn't me. I'm asking you. Speak." Anson lunged forward, still simmering with alcohol, and roared at the people in the pouring rain, "If we don't win tonight, how long do you plan to wait? Until we can't take it anymore and the army has to move it? Until the fortress runs out of ammunition and supplies and you surrender?" At this point, even Anson himself couldn't help but chuckle. "Don't dream. Before you lies a fortified fortress. Behind you are severed supply lines and Imperial cavalry sweeping and looting everywhere. If we don't win, we'll die without a burial place. We'll be attacked from both sides by the Empire and wiped out, but we can win. Tonight, we can win." His tone shifted, and Anson's gaze swept across the ranks, "because we have nearly 5,000 men, heavy artillery, and guns. We are not helpless scum to be slaughtered at their mercy. We are soldiers who know how to fight and kill. They can kill us, and we can kill them. It's that simple." The next second, Anson raised his Leopold rifle, pointing the muzzle towards Thunder Fortress. "Tonight, those Imperial scum are hiding behind the walls of Thunder Fortress, wearing clothes that aren't soaked, by the fire, eating hot bread and soup, maybe even taking a bath, and then sleeping soundly in bed. Why? Because they absolutely cannot imagine that such a bunch of insane idiots would launch an attack on a well-defended fortress on a stormy night, just like they couldn't understand why a bunch of fools would hold their positions in the artillery emplacements, single-handedly repelling an Imperial army 3 times their size, until reinforcements arrived." Anson gave a thumbs up, pointing forcefully to his chest. We were that idiot whose mind is only on how to win, how to survive on this damn battlefield. So, I'm telling you now, I believe we'll win, and I'm confident we'll win, and you." The desperate shouts faded into the torrential rain. Anson stood alone on the gun emplacement, facing countless eyes staring at him through the rain. Thump. Lisa, standing at the very front, suddenly slammed her rifle into the muddy ground. Soon, the entire first rank, along with all the soldiers of the 1st Regiment, began to raise their rifles and slam them into the ground in unison. The chaotic sounds gradually became orderly and unified after repeated interactions. Thump, 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 thump. This orderly response was like the prelude to a rising tide, followed by wave after wave, more and more, denser and denser, until the sound drowned out the rain and echoed throughout the entire front line. Thump, thump, thump. A dumbfounded Carl Bain stared at the soldiers before him as if they were idiots. Lisa, her face flushed with excitement, watched as more and more people around her followed suit, smashing the weapons even harder. Anson, a smile playing on his lips, slowly turned around and raised his rifle to the soldiers behind him. "Soldiers of the 1st Regiment, those who believe in victory, follow me. The rest, follow the 1st Regiment. In a dozen minutes, it will be the 100th year of the Saints' calendar. Let's go to Thunder Fortress together, and say to those newly in bed Imperial scum, Happy New Year." Chapter 41. Let the sound of cannons pierce through the torrential rain. Artillery in position, with a messenger's shout, 120 artillerymen, divided into 4 groups, dragged ammunition wagons and braved the raging wind and rain to enter the artillery positions, calmly beginning their work. Standing beside a 12-pounder cannon, Ludwig Franz held a still tickling pocket watch in his right hand, his left hand resting on the rain-soaked, cold cannon barrel. As a general who had trained in artillery, only these war machines brimming with potential could give him boundless confidence, ensuring he wouldn't regret his initial decision. Transporting these 14 cannons from various cannon foundries within the Kingdom of Clovis to the siege positions required the mobilization of 12 heavy-duty wagons, not including 50 ammunition wagons and 30 supply wagons, as well as the requisitioned steam trains from the transport department. Even just these 4 cannons and 3 mortars alone would require 240 heavy turrets and nearly 300 soldiers, enough to form 2 elite cavalry companies. And if the resources spent on artillery were used on infantry, he could at least form another conscripted army of equal strength. But it was all worth it. Those Clovis fools who would rather exchange 10 heavy cannons for 3,000 soldiers and only know how to line up for executions will never understand that even a full-strength volley of fire from a regular army unit is far less damaging to enemy morale and casualties than a single artillery barrage. As for the Empire, which still uses artillery to cover cavalry charges, Ludwig was even more disdainful. These remnants living in the past had the world's best artillery but didn't know how to use it. The moment the first cannon with a range of 800 meters and a rate of fire of 2 rounds per minute was born, it became the new darling of the battlefield. Even the fiercest steed, the strongest armor, the most skilled rider, would pale in comparison to 12-pound cannon and shrapnel shells. Load ammunition. First calibration. The ammunition handlers immediately rushed to the front of the cannon. After one man cleaned a breech, they skillfully loaded the propellant and shells into the barrel. Immediately following, one man calibrated, one sealed a breech, 2 measured the firing range, and 1 held a breech block. With almost instinctive, seamless teamwork, a team of artillerymen completed the firing preparations for the nearly 1-ton cannon in less than half a minute. But Ludwig still felt a slight dissatisfaction. When he was a gunner, he could prepare a cannon for firing in as little as 15 seconds. He firmly believed that one day, cannons with even faster loading speeds, longer ranges, and even beyond the horizon would be born. The required manpower would be reduced from a dozen to just a few, and the operation would be simplified to the ease of pulling a trigger. One day, she will shatter the pride of those ignorant and stubborn people, and truly become the master of war. All hands on deck. Ludwig, his face grim, raised his sword above his head, his gaze fixed on the front lines, seemingly piercing through the rain to see the gates of Thundercastle in the night. In the torrential downpour, time continued to tick away, the soaked gunners gripping the breech blocks tightly. The entire artillery position waited silently for Ludwig, for the moment his pocket watch would strike. Tick, with a crisp, melodious sound. The hands of the pocket watch finally reached 1:15. Ludwig's pupils constricted, and he swung his sword forward, his stern face radiating a slight roar. Fire, boom, amidst billowing white smoke, the earth-shaking tremor almost simultaneously with the lightning bolts from the dome exploded. A blinding, ghastly white light, a sharp whistling sound streaking overhead, it seemed the entire world was shaking. In the pitch-black midnight rain, the soldiers of the 1st Regiment, maintaining 4 columns amidst the deafening roar, cautiously marched towards the fortress, heads held high. "Don't panic, these are our artillery pieces," Karl Bain shouted, surveying his surroundings. "Keep calm, eyes forward, 1st Regiment, continue." Amidst the shouts, Lisa, pale with fright from the artillery fire, trembled. Standing in the first rank, she desperately straightened her thin chest, forcing herself to resist the urge to reach for the canned food in her coat. "I say, are you sure this is all right?" Karl, who was trying to remain calm, scurried over to Anson's side, his body trembling slightly. "It's so late at night, and it's pouring rain. I'm starting to panic." "Don't worry, it'll be fine." Anson, who had finally waited for the shelling, shrugged and deliberately didn't lower his voice. "The gun positions were marked in advance, and the target is Thunder Fortress, which anyone with eyes can see. If we still get shells on our heads, our brigadier general, who's an artilleryman, might as well be fired. Even if we take a step back, we're standing on the very front of the forward position now. If the artillery wanted to hit this spot, how desperate would his artillerymen be to kill us to lower the muzzle like this? What do you think?" That's true." Watching Anson gradually relax from his anxiety, Anson, who was just as uncertain as Karl, couldn't help but sigh inwardly, feeling something inside him disappear even faster. Boom! Another boom came from the artillery position behind them. Amidst billowing smoke rising from the artillery positions, the cannons, having completed their initial calibration firing, entered continuous firing mode. Panting ammunition handlers tirelessly shuttled between the cannons and ammunition carts, continuously loading shells into the scorching, smoking chambers. Amidst wave after wave of deafening roars from the artillery positions, solid shot, whistling sharply through the air, tore through the rain and landed precisely on the walls of Thunder Fortress. The solid stone shattered instantly, exploding in a fleeting cloud of smoke in the downpour. But such bombardment was insufficient to inflict substantial damage on Thunder Fortress. Despite being merely a military outpost within its territory, its walls were designed to strict standards. The outer layer of earth greatly reduced the power of the solid shot, and its slightly sloping structure made it more robust than a vertical wall, unlikely to collapse easily. Finally, the first column of troops, having stabilized its ranks, regrouped and, amidst the resounding artillery fire from their own lines and the torrential rain shrouded in dark clouds, marched in orderly formation towards Thunder Fortress. The remaining infantry regiments, huddled in the forward positions, also emerged from their trenches, maintaining 3 ranks, ideal for concentrated fire, following closely behind to the light, pleasant beat of drums. Just then, Thunder Fortress, sensing the commotion outside, finally began to retaliate. Boom! A flash of fire on the city wall was followed by a piercing scream through the rain. Solid shot, tracing graceful arcs, splattered joyfully across the muddy ground, creating sprays of water, and as it passed through the ranks of infantry, it would crush the legs of any soldiers who stood in its way. In the horrified gaze of the conscripted soldiers, shells rained down from the sky, almost like raindrops, scattering across the air like a barrage of bullets as they hurtled towards the besieged position. Soon, the deafening roar completely suppressed the firepower of the besieged position. The barrage, denser than the conscripted soldiers could have imagined, instantly saturated the entire besieged position. If the conscripted soldiers were still stationed on the position, more than a third of them would likely have perished, but now, almost all of their forces were concentrated on the front lines. The Imperial defenders, who had hastily opened fire in response, failed to notice this, and the artillery fire, scattered throughout the besieged position, caused almost no casualties to the conscripted soldiers. Boom! A sudden, deafening explosion rang out. The Imperial defenders on the city wall only had time to feel their feet shake before hearing desperate screams from below, the city gate. The city gate has been breached. Anson, standing at the front of the ranks, narrowed his eyes and slammed his rifle forward. First platoon, fix bayonets, charge. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 42 Attack on the High Wall. The piercing shriek tearing through the rain still echoed overhead, punctuating the solid walls and ravaged battlefields with bursts of fire. Amidst the choking smoke, the conscripted soldiers, practically braving the blasts, impatiently charged across the last trench before the fortress, launching an assault on the still-burning ruins of the city gate. Charge, fix bayonets, hundreds of roars and resounding bugle calls echoed through the downpour. The conscripted infantry, trembling with fear amidst the thunder and explosions, raised their rifles, bayonets gleaming, venting their terror with shouts and charges. Caught completely off guard, the Imperial defenders panicked, allowing the conscripted soldiers to breach the outermost trench and the city gate. Only after seeing the enemy enter the fortress did they hastily organize their first line of defense. First rank, deploy in line. Carl Bain, who was the first to charge into the fortress, immediately gave the order, simultaneously pulling the still-running Lisa behind him and raising his command sword in his right hand. Loose formation, all in position. Ready, volley, bang. Almost simultaneously, flashes of fire erupted from both lines. In the billowing white smoke, several figures at the forefront fell silently to the ground. The next second, just as the Imperial army, maintaining a tight formation, was preparing for another volley, a tidal wave of conscripts surged from the flanks behind the first rank, bayonets at the ready, charging towards them. Bang! Another volley, and the conscripts at the forefront fell one after another as if crashing into an invisible wall. But such meager firepower might stop an attack of dozens or hundreds, but it couldn't stop thousands of terrified fools who only knew how to charge. Without the advance of bayonets or the slow, methodical firing, the conscripted soldiers charged forward in disarray, engaging in a brutal, hand-to-hand combat from the very beginning. The glory of Clovis, long live the Empire! The moment the two groups collided, countless shouts of battle erupted. Hundreds upon hundreds of conscripted soldiers, pouring out their fear, surged wave after wave against the Imperial soldiers' tenaciously defended positions. As a formidable outpost and military stronghold, Thunder Fortress possessed ample and complete fortifications. Even inside the fortress, there were numerous breastworks and palisades, as well as warehouses and sturdy towers serving as temporary strongholds. The light artillery on the walls could also be turned to fire into the fortress at any time. But at this moment, both sides seemed to have forgotten this, crowding together at the small entrance beneath the ruins of the city gate, fighting savagely with bayonets, rifle butts, and every other means at their disposal. The Imperial defenders inside the fortress, seeing their fragile defenses crumbling and their artillery fire blocked by their allies' formations, were forced to engage in a brutal melee, desperately holding on to their precarious line. Only the 1st Regiment, halted in time by Carl Bain, maintained its line of fire at the breach, firing freely towards any potential enemy direction despite being nearly overwhelmed by their allies behind them. Chaos. Utter chaos. Looking at the enemy charging in from all directions in the torrential rain, Carl, gritting his teeth, turned sharply to Anson, who still had time to fire his gun, and roared, "Commander, stop doing the soldiers' work. Use this time to think of a solution. Right now, the enemy is foolishly entangled with us at the breach, but they'll figure it out sooner or later. If we haven't broken through by then, we're really done for. It's alright, even in chaos, we'll fight chaotically." Anson calmly pulled the trigger. With a bang, the opposing line soldier lost consciousness and fell into the mud. "Have the soldiers follow me to the left and see if we can bypass the front." Looking at the tense Carl, Anson spoke while simultaneously reloading his gun. "If we can bypass it, try to storm the walls and capture the artillery positions. What if we can't?" "No, let's not say any more." Carl nearly fainted upon receiving the reply, but rolled his eyes and carried out the order. "All to position, left turn, double columns, rapid assault." With shouts, the more than 300 soldiers who received the order quickly turned and began a rapid maneuver in the direction of the bugle call, mostly from the first column, but also including many soldiers from other scattered units, who followed the column to the left of the fortress. The Imperial defenders, who had been hit hard at the start, finally began to recover, starting to reorganize their defenses amidst the chaos. A series of urgent and chaotic bugle calls rang out within the fortress. Imperial soldiers in blue and white uniforms huddled together, taking cover in front of their chests and on either side of the palisade, forming a network of fire in small groups in the corners of the fortress, relentlessly firing at the conscripted soldiers pouring in through the breach. The Imperial soldiers, relying on makeshift fortifications, quickly established a foothold outside the breach, but the problem was that the numbers on both sides were now more than double, and the flimsy defenses were insufficient to withstand the charge of hundreds or even thousands. More importantly, in the dead of night and in the pouring rain, one couldn't clearly see if the people around them were still alive. The gunfire and smoke, masked by the rain and darkness, were far less frightening than in daytime, allowing the conscripted soldiers to charge the lines at a greater cost than usual. Thud. Lisa, her eyes wide with hatred, gritted her teeth, intending to plunge her bayonet into the body of an Imperial soldier. Before she could even pull the bayonet out, Carl behind her kicked the still struggling corpse to the ground. Behind them, the first rank of troops, barely maintaining its formation, had already broken through the outer defensive line and began advancing towards the city wall along the gentle slope behind it. "I told you, don't rush so far forward." Gasping for breath, Carl Bain grabbed Lisa by the collar. The defiant little girl struggled desperately in his grasp. "You're a skirmisher company commander, not a suicide vanguard." "I'll say it again, you're a skirmisher company commander. Your only task is to kill Anson Bach, or any of us, with your rifle before anyone tries to kill him, understand?" Lisa, her hair being pulled, pouted and nodded aggrievedly. Carl sighed, glancing at Lisa, whose eyes were slightly red. If he hadn't seen it with his own eyes, he wouldn't have believed that this little girl was a monster capable of blowing someone's head off with artillery fire. Just then, everyone, down, Anson, standing at the front, suddenly crouched down in terror, roaring behind him. Startled, Carl, though he hadn't seen anything clearly, instinctively dropped to the ground, pressing Lisa's head to his side. Boom! The next moment, a thunderous sound exploded in his ears. All the soldiers who hadn't had time to take cover were instantly torn to pieces, spraying blood and shattered limbs from the city walls, mingling with rain and mud. Anson, his skull throbbing with pain, vividly recalled the scene he had seen: 2 light artillery pieces loading shotgun shells, plus nearly a company of battle infantry. A direct charge would instantly result in a quarter of their casualties. "All in position," Anson roared, his right hand simultaneously reaching behind his waist. "Grenades ready." Grenades. This guy, was he talking about those things that just smoke and don't explode? Carl, momentarily stunned, suddenly understood when he saw Anson's eyes. The next second, a dozen black grenades soared into the air, landing around the light artillery on the city wall. Seeing the falling objects begin to spew white smoke, the Imperial soldiers, their faces pale with shock, scattered in all directions. But what awaited them was not an explosion, but a bayonet charge by over 300 conscripted soldiers. At 1:45 a.m., the First Corps broke through the outer defenses and scaled the city wall. Chapter 43 Battle of Thunder Fortress. In the moonless, pitch black midnight, the Grenadier Regiment, braving the biting wind and torrential rain, marched towards Oaktown along the muddy roads. The situation could only be described as dire. Roman, mounted on horseback, followed closely on the right side of the column, a hint of worry showing on his cold, rain-soaked face. Although he knew that marching through the night would be anything but easy, he resolutely decided to set off despite the storm, striving to reach Oaktown as quickly as possible and restore order. While ample rain gear prevented the soldiers from becoming completely soaked, the impact of the downpour on the road conditions was severe enough. Days of torrential rain had washed away all the road signs, making the already muddy roads even more rugged, and making marching in formation incredibly difficult. Add to that the poor visibility at night, and since their departure, the entire Grenadier Regiment hadn't even covered a tenth of the distance, almost only half of their planned distance. Lieutenant Colonel Roman, the urgent shout made Roman tighten his grip on the reins and look behind him. A scout cavalryman, torch in hand, galloped along the side of the column, only stopping just in front of him. By order of Brigadier General Ludwig Franz, commander of the Remingfort Regiment, suspend the Grenadier Regiment's advance to Oaktown and immediately return the way you came. What? Startled, Roman immediately gestured behind him, and after a few bugle calls, the marching column came to a halt. The Brigadier General entrusted me to deliver a message to you. The anxious cavalryman approached Roman and spoke in a low voice. Things have taken an unexpected turn. He must issue the order to attack Thunder Fort tonight, but it is also important to quell the unrest in Oaktown as soon as possible, so please make your own judgment, Lieutenant Colonel Roman. If you think, what time does it start? Before the other man could finish, Roman, his eyes fierce, asked urgently, I'm asking you, what time does the siege begin? The cavalryman was slightly taken aback. It's exactly 1 o'clock in the morning. Roman, his face somewhat grim, took out his pocket watch. By the flickering light of the torch in the cavalryman's hand, the numbers on the watch face stopped at exactly 10:30 in the downpour. Grenadiers, all hands on deck, about face. The instant the decision was made, Roman, having tossed aside his pocket watch, snatched a torch from a cavalryman, raised the flame high, and spurred his horse toward Thundercastle. Rear ranks become vanguard, advance on Thundercastle. In the torrential rain, the battle at Thundercastle Fortress was gradually reaching its climax. The hastily constructed defensive system of the Imperial defenders, relying on breastworks and palisades, was thrown into chaos by the conscripts' fearless charge, teetering on the brink of collapse at a visible pace. The hastily assembled lines were quickly overwhelmed by the conscripts, who outnumbered them 3 or 4 to 1. Relying on their numerical advantage, the conscripts, bearing casualties they would never normally endure, charged into the Imperial defenders' lines amidst the smoke and volleys of gunfire, turning the offensive and defensive battle into complete melee. Meanwhile, the artillerymen on the city walls, having spotted the enemy, aimed their light cannons at the city amidst the desperate shouts of their officers and gunners. Looking down into the darkness of the city walls, unsure of where the enemy was, and wary of artillery fire from the besieging positions behind them, as well as the unpredictable onslaught of conscripted soldiers, they could only fire in the direction of the enemy, relying solely on instinct. Amidst the deafening roar of the cannons, shrapnel shells exploded above Thunder Fortress. Countless tiny lead bullets, carried by the torrential rain, rained down on the crowd, leaving a trail of blood and gore, limbs strewn everywhere, screams and wails echoing through the horde. Whether those hit were enemy or friendly fire, neither the artillerymen nor their officers could afford to think too much about it. They simply mechanically operated their cannons, firing at the preset enemy attack positions. Under such indiscriminate bombardment, the conscripted army's offensive momentum was slightly halted, but the artillery fire from above also shattered many defensive fortifications. The previously narrow passages became much clearer, even clearing the way for the rear ranks. Seeing the vanguard army so quickly open a breach, the conscripted officers, who had originally planned to cheer from the rear, saw an opportunity and sounded the charge, sending their troops rushing through the breach. As a new wave of conscripts poured into the city gate, the fortress's internal defenses went from being on the verge of collapse to being fragmented, with each unit fighting independently under the command of its night officers to cope with a conscripted army, which outnumbered them by more than 2. Although the Imperial soldiers displayed a morale completely different from usual under the command of the night officers, this did not conceal the fact that they had not received much shooting training and did not know how to deal with unexpected situations. While the Imperial soldiers could manage a back-and-forth exchange during the initial volley fire, their rigid and inflexible line fighting tactics immediately exposed their weaknesses when the melee and hand-to-hand combat began. However, the attacking conscripts were also mostly new recruits with only 3 months of training, capable only of going through the motions in volley fire and charges. They lacked sufficient hand-to-hand combat training, their skill level being comparable to that of the Imperial soldiers. They only gained a slight advantage through sheer numbers and night fighting. This allowed the retreating Imperial soldiers to maintain their lines, unlike previous sieges where a single assault would cause a complete collapse, destroying the entire defensive line. As the lines fell one after another, the numerical advantage of the attacking conscripts became increasingly apparent. Forced into hand-to-hand combat, the Imperial defenders struggled to withstand the chaotic mass charges, their fragmented lines were cornered, and they fought desperately. Relying on their numerical superiority, the conscripted soldiers, without even realizing it, successfully extended the battle into the fortress itself, further hindering the Imperial defenders' ability to regroup and spreading the melee to every corner of the fortress. But this sudden, unexpected attack was not enough to completely crush the Imperial defenders. The advantages and disadvantages of the torrential rain and night fighting were evenly matched for both sides. Unaware of casualties and the overall situation, the Imperial soldiers were also fiercely defending their positions, putting up a relentless resistance. Small-scale skirmishes erupted around breastworks, palisades, and even light artillery pieces. When ammunition ran out, they used bayonets. When bayonets broke, they used rifle butts. When rifles were lost, they used swords, fists, boots, teeth, using everything they could find to kill those who looked similar, dressed similarly, only their clothes were different colors. Within the fortress, it was impossible to distinguish the front line from the safe rear. In every corner, people were fighting, shooting, slaughtering, screaming, and dying. The thunderous roar of artillery fire continued to echo across the besieged positions. The smoke enveloping the artillery positions was so thick that the gunners could no longer aim. Panting heavily, the artillerymen mechanically repeated the same task, stuffing shells and propellant into the trembling barrels. Standing in the thick smoke, Ludwig stood with his hands behind his back, his eyes fixed on the distant battlefield, seemingly oblivious to the scorching heat of the gun barrels beside him. "What time is it? Report." "It's exactly 2:11 a.m., the messenger behind him, barely suppressing a cough, shouted. So, a full hour had passed since the start of the battle? Taking advantage of the night attack and the sudden downpour, the conscripted army seemed to have gained a good start, but the outcome was far from certain. The enemy hadn't completely collapsed and still had a chance to turn the tide. Watching the fierce battle raging in the distance, Ludwig finally understood why Anson was so determined and believed Roman would return with the Grenadier regiment. At this stage of the battle, discussing tactics is meaningless. The only way to victory is to deploy as many reserves as possible in the final moments before the enemy collapses. After a moment of silence, Ludwig made his decision. Order, at 3:10, the cavalry company, artillery company, and all reserves, prepare for battle and launch a general offensive against Thunderberg. Yes, sir. Chapter 44. All tactics are for decapitation. Bang! The impact from the pull of the trigger made Anson pause slightly. A lead bullet flew just past his cheek, exploding on the city wall. Calmly, Anson watched the figure fall from the opposite wall, expertly pulling back the bolt and reloading, his gaze fixed on the next target he could see in his mind. Only now did he truly realize the extent of the impact becoming a sorcerer had on him. First and foremost, his reaction speed was incredible. If he could perceive and notice something instantly, his body could react swiftly, instantly focusing and immersing himself in it. Like now, he could judge who posed the greatest threat to him through mental images, the expressions of surrounding enemies, the direction his rifle was aimed at, and even things he couldn't see, and quickly decide who to take out first. It was something somewhat like intuition, yet completely different. What it was remained to be discovered. Secondly, there was his sense of distance. The sorcerer's ability is to deny and alter reality, its weakness being a limited range. However, this weakness grants him an exceptional sense of distance, the ability to pinpoint the precise distance between himself and any object within a 20-meter radius. And when this ability is combined with the superpower he gained from his transmigration, it's exactly what happened in that instant. While firing simultaneously, he dodged a fatal shot with just a small-scale dodge, simultaneously hitting his opponent. Bang! Another shot, and the man holding the shrapnel shell had his neck pierced by a lead bullet. Blood gushing from his wound, he staggered against the wall, falling off the rampart along with the shell in his arms. A few seconds later, the entire section of the wall trembled with a sudden, deafening roar. Boom! The sudden roar acted as a signal. The conscripted soldiers and imperial soldiers on the wall roared, bayonets raised, and charged towards their opponents. Charge! 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 For the glory of Clovis, for His Majesty the Emperor, stop them! With roars, the imperial soldiers launched a near-mad counterattack against the conscripted soldiers charging up the city walls. Time and again, they were driven back by the chaotic bayonet walls and volleys of gunfire, leaving behind a trail of corpses. Relying on a few veterans and Anson's superpower, the first column of troops that charged up the city walls was not defeated by the imperial defenders' counterattack. Instead, they gradually gained a foothold and even advanced against the enemy's counterattack. And then what? Karl Bang roared at Anson in a hoarse voice, "We listened to you, you madman, and went up the city walls to fight those imperial scum for the artillery positions. Now we're almost surrounded. In less than 10 minutes, they'll find that we only have 200 or 300 men at most. 3 or 4 rounds of light artillery can blast us all to smithereens. What are we going to do now, Lieutenant Karl? I think you need to calm down first," Anson comforted him. "I can't calm down, and I'm not your adjutant." "Then pretend to be calm." Anson, with a smile, looked at Karl with unusual seriousness in his eyes, then, along the city wall, looked to your left. Karl, suppressing the urge to curse, looked up, his face blank as he looked at the chaotic fortress battlefield to his left. "My commander, could you elaborate?" "All right, let's put it another way. Tell me, what's the simplest and fastest way to defeat an imperial army?" "Kill their commander. Even a fool knows that," Karl blurted out. Then his face instantly showed horror. "You don't mean to kill the fortress commander, do you?" "What else could it be?" With a smirk, Anson tightened the bolt of his rifle, aimed at the gunner opposite him, and pulled the trigger by feel. Bang! As the smoke cleared, an imperial soldier groaned and slumped onto the breech of the field gun, the imperial defenders on the gun emplacement in chaos. What else? Bypass the imperial scum's frontal defenses on the city walls and directly attack the main fortress? You make that sound so easy. Ignoring the eye roll, Karl roared at Anson, "We only have 200 or 300 men here, less than half a regiment, and how many troops does the enemy have inside the main fortress?" Anson countered, "Right now, the conscripted army has 4,000 or 5,000 men, and at least 2/3 have already stormed the fortress. Even if the enemy still has more than 2,000 troops, how many would they be willing to station in the main fortress?" "Even so, but..." Karl's words trailed off, suddenly falling silent. "Yes, why not?" Although a surprise attack had created a breach, given the conscripted army's morale and fighting strength, which were comparable to the imperial scum's, expecting them to expand their gains with unwavering will and fearlessness was a gross overestimation of their abilities. The bewildered imperial defenders certainly wouldn't surrender easily. The fortress still contained numerous stone buildings and semi-permanent fortifications for their retreat and defense, and the situation would stabilize quickly. According to Karl Bang's estimation, the conscripted army, relying purely on luck, had already achieved its maximum gains. The real deciding factor would be the imperial defenders' willpower and whether the brigadier general's reinforcements would arrive on time. For a long period before that, it would likely be a chaotic melee where both sides were locked in a stalemate. Since the vast majority of the enemy forces were currently trapped in the meat grinder of the fighting, and the headquarters was located on the opposite side of the siege of the main fortress, its defenses and manpower were undoubtedly weak. If they could figure this out, and find a way to bypass the enemy's main force and directly storm the main fortress to kill the imperial commander, Crowbernal, wouldn't the outcome of the battle be decided immediately? But how are you going to get to the main castle? The walls are riddled with imperial garrison gun emplacements. Karl looked at Anson with difficulty, still finding this mad tactic hard to accept. "Are you going to fight your way through them one by one?" Anson nodded slightly. This was the only real challenge of the entire plan. Even if he could evade the enemy in front, the only passable route was still heavily fortified with enemy gun emplacements on the walls. A single shot from a 24-pound cannon, whether grape shot or solid shot, would be fatal, even for someone wearing full armor. Besides that, there was another concern he couldn't mention to Karl Bang: the old gods. The battle had been going on for over an hour, and even with this search area expanded as much as possible, Anson hadn't spotted any old gods. Why wasn't this the perfect opportunity now, with the battle so intense? Or had he really gotten ahead of them, depriving them of their chance? Just then, a faint shriek rang in Anson's ears. Having experienced something similar before, he instantly paled. "Everyone, get down!" With all his might, Anson pushed Carl down, dropping his rifle as he threw himself to the ground. Artillery fire, boom! The next moment, a violent explosion and flash of light engulfed the entire fortress. Accompanied by a deafening roar, a powerful shockwave followed. The fortress cannon, weighing over 2 tons, was hurled into the sky along with the rubble in the explosion, the dazzling flames flashing in the rain, turning the pitch-black fortress battlefield into daylight. In the instant the flames flickered, the brick and stone breastwork shattered like paper. All the soldiers who hadn't had time to dodge were instantly swallowed by the flames and shockwave, their screams and wails drowned out by the ear-piercing sound. Chapter 45 The Battery. Battery destroyed, target hit confirmed. As the messenger's slightly excited voice rang out, a joyful atmosphere began to envelop the artillery position. Many soldiers couldn't help but stand up, their faces filled with barely concealed excitement as they gazed at the towering flames on the fortress walls. Even Ludwig, who had been on edge the entire time, couldn't resist the urge to smirk, his right hand gripping his sword, his knuckles turning slightly white. He himself hadn't expected that simply raising the cannon muzzle slightly, unintentionally, would actually hit the main gun emplacement of Thunderberg. Even if tonight's siege ends in failure, Thunder Fortress, as a fortress, has lost its greatest threat and can no longer organize a bombardment of the same scale as before. All fortifications will be reduced to ashes in tonight's melee, and the hastily constructed positions cannot possibly withstand an attack from an army several times its size. The only remaining threat is their elite cavalry and officer corps, but how much power can these mounted warriors contribute in a siege dominated by melee and line of sight? The outcome is already decided. Silence, suppressing his inner joy, Ludwig, his face grim, interrupted the soldiers' cheers. It was just a coincidence that we destroyed one of the enemy's gun emplacements. The battle continues, it's far from over, maintain the current momentum. Continue bombarding the walls of Thunderberg to suppress them and provide cover for the attacking army. Raise the mortar firing angle and attempt to bombard the main castle. Yes, sir, the soldiers replied in unison. Ludwig nodded slightly, glancing at the excited, flushed messenger behind him. Any news of the Grenadier Regiment? Not yet. The messenger, immediately regaining his composure, looked nervously at the Brigadier General. I've already dispatched all the cavalry. Once the Grenadier Regiment returns, someone will immediately go to meet them, and nearby cavalry will be notified. Ludwig said nothing, glancing down at his pocket watch. The time was 2:30. In 40 minutes, regardless of whether the Grenadier Regiment arrived, he had to order the general offensive. Without the help of his most trusted Grenadier Regiment, could he really win with his poorly trained and inexperienced recruits? The next moment, without hesitation, Ludwig raised his eyes and shouted sharply, "Order a small cavalry squad to stay behind for support. The rest of you retreat to your positions for the final push before the general offensive." Boom! A violent explosion rang out without warning. Ludwig, interrupted, didn't even have time to be surprised before instinctively turning his gaze towards the direction of the explosion. On the fortress's gun emplacements, shrouded in smoke and dust from the downpour, flames once again illuminated the night. What is this? Stunned, Ludwig turned his gaze to his side, but the soldiers within the artillery positions were also dumbfounded. The ammunition handler, frozen in place, gaped, oblivious even to the falling shells hitting his feet. Before everyone could recover from their shock, another thunderous explosion resounded from the city walls, engulfed in flames. Boom! Another burst of fire shot into the sky amidst the smoke. Anson, his scalp tingling, lay prone on the ground, eyes tightly shut, his mind replaying the images around him. Carl, leaning against the edge of the city wall, desperately used a broken flagpole for support, shouting something hoarsely. A terrified Lisa clutched her rifle, huddled beneath a charred corpse, her small body trembling uncontrollably. Amidst the violent tremors and roars, soldiers fell to the ground, screaming as they plummeted from the walls into the rubble and the spiked trenches. But the explosions from the opposite emplacement continued unabated, one tremor after another, flashes of fire after flash, flickering relentlessly in the torrential rain and smoke. Debris and rubble hurtling into the sky, along with charred remains and military supplies, rained down, scattering across the still shaking city walls. Anson gritted his teeth, feeling utterly hopeless. Ludwig's decision to suppress the fortress walls was slightly unexpected. According to their pre-battle plan, The artillery positions should have ceased fire half an hour ago. However, considering the Archbishop's son was an artilleryman, his over-reliance on artillery support without any hope of victory wasn't particularly surprising. But one thing was certain, none of the cannons or explosive shells on the besieging positions possessed this level of power. So the question arose, what exactly did Ludwig's shot hit? It was probably the shells and propellant piled up on the gun emplacements, right, inside the artillery position. The still-shaken messenger, gazing at the billowing smoke from the distant city walls, couldn't help but swallow hard. Thunder Fortress is, after all, just an internal supply depot, not a border fortress. It wasn't designed to withstand a large-scale siege, so the passageways on the walls were designed to be very narrow to save space. The Imperial garrison probably realized this too. To ensure a rapid counterattack in case of attack, without worrying about ammunition shortages, they stockpiled large quantities of shells and propellant in the gun emplacements. So, that shot just now hit Thunder Fortress's ammunition depot, right? Looking at the still flaming city walls, Ludwig's face was extremely grim. Fate seemed to be playing a cruel joke on him, having eliminated the greatest threat and obstacle with a single shot, blocking all reinforcements and any possibility of turning the tide of battle. At least until the explosion ceased, any military operations against Thunder Fortress had to be temporarily halted. Even if the Grenadier Regiment arrived immediately, they couldn't possibly charge into the inferno. However, this might not be such a bad thing after all. Noticing the Brigadier's increasingly grim expression, the messenger quickly added, because Thunder Fortress's fortifications are very sturdy, the explosions were almost entirely confined to the walls, causing negligible casualties to the conscripted troops besieging the fortress. It's a stroke of good luck amidst misfortune, and you see, the explosions have stopped. A heavy feeling settled in his chest. This was the only sensation Anson felt as he got up. Pushing aside the charred corpses that were unrecognizable on top of him, Anson struggled to his feet, a strong urge to vomit churning within him, but he quickly suppressed it. Anson, I'm alright, Anson responded, looking behind him at Lisa. Her small, thin figure had somehow appeared beside Carl, struggling to pull her adjutant from under a pile of rubble. The three of them breathed a sigh of relief upon seeing each other, supporting each other against the broken wall as they began to assemble their troops and tally the casualties. Nearly 300 men had charged up the wall following the banner. After the count, just over 200 remained, a casualty count of 1/3, nearing the point of morale collapse. But compared to the Imperial defenders opposite, Anson found himself relatively lucky. The entire fortress was engulfed in flames, all fortifications and cavities crushed by the blast wave, charred remains and bones buried under rubble everywhere. Looking at this scene, he silently turned his head, exchanged a glance with Carl, who had already stood up, and nodded. The next second, Anson picked up his rifle from the ground, raised the gleaming bayonet high above his head. First rank, assault team, assemble, target, main castle, for victory, advance. Chapter 46. 2 orders. Bang! A lead bullet struck him squarely between the eyebrows, and blood, as white as paint, gushed from the pierced skull, splattering in an irregular fan shape on the door behind the Imperial soldier. Almost simultaneously with the corpse falling, a small, thin figure hidden in the shadows had silently reached the door, using the butt of a rifle to brace against the body, and carefully pushed open the still dripping wooden door. Squeak! Just as the corpse lost its footing and was about to collapse, a rifle with a bayonet suddenly emerged from the shadows and fired without hesitation towards the door. Thud! The cold bayonet pierced through the gunpowder smoke, penetrating directly through the jaw of the soldier behind the door, who fell silently to the ground as the bayonet was withdrawn. The battle was extremely brief, without even a sound. After laying the two corpses flat on the ground and carefully confirming that there were no guards around, Lisa nodded to herself triumphantly, put her hands on her hips, and waved her small hand behind her back. With a sigh of relief, Carl and Anson led the soldiers of the 1st Legion out of a secluded corner and entered the main castle through the wooden door. The 1st Company will deploy on the city wall, using the parapet to stand guard outside the gate, constantly reporting the situation to those around them. If exposed, immediately seal the wooden door and retreat into the main castle. The 2nd Company will enter the main castle with the regimental commander and me. Each squad leader will maintain constant contact and be on standby in platoon units. The rest of you will cover the wounded and rest on the spot. After a series of orders were given, Carl Bain, with a somber expression, looked at Anson. I know the main castle well, The structure is very compact. Bringing too many people would only make us targets. One company is enough to handle it. I'll lead the way from now on. You will command when we encounter battles or decide on directions, okay?" Anson nodded without objection. He had originally thought so too. If the commander of the Imperial Army, that is, Kroger Bernard, is not commanding the army outside, where do you think he is most likely to be right now? Carl frowned slightly and pondered for a few minutes before seriously speculating. Probably 3 places. First is the commander's bedroom, the safest and most secure room in Thunder Keep, located on the 3rd floor of the main castle, near the middle. By the way, we're on the 5th floor now. Then is the map room, on the 2nd floor near the spiral staircase on the right. There's also a warehouse directly opposite the stables, making it easy to escape. Finally, the main hall on the bottom floor, a spacious and rather long room. If he's planning to take the conscripts who stormed the main castle down with him, it's a good place. So, we can search all the way down the stairs. Anson immediately realized. Yet, it seems so. Carl took out a cigarette, lit it, and nodded seriously. Then why did you take so long? Carl coughed twice, a little embarrassed, with a cigarette in his mouth. Ahem. I finally found a place where I wouldn't get wet, so I wanted to take the opportunity to smoke a cigarette and be lazy. Go, lead the way. Carl, full of complaints, was pushed forward by Anson with the butt of his rifle, grumbling as he walked deeper into the main castle. Led by Carl Bain, this local. The team easily found the spiral staircase inside the main castle and descended it floor by floor. Upon reaching the 4th floor, the team split up. Anson, Carl, and Lisa led one platoon to the main hall, while the remaining 2 platoons searched the bedrooms and map room. This method conserved manpower and ensured that if the Imperial garrison commander, Kroger, were exposed, regardless of whether he could be killed immediately, there would be troops on the remaining floors to keep him out, guaranteeing no one escaped. Although Thunder Castle appeared to be a modern building from the outside, its internal structure looked virtually unchanged from the previous era. The corridors were so narrow that only 2 people could walk side by side, completely open and without any defensive features. A single shot could take you from one end to the other. The secluded spiral staircase was deliberately placed near the edge of the protective wall. If the wall were breached, anyone trying to escape via the stairs would be gambling with their life. These structures are utterly outdated now, but in an era dominated by cold weapons, narrow passageways meant a small squad of elite knights could easily block off an entire corridor. The spiral staircases near the walls were essential for the castle's occupant to escape before being discovered by the enemy. In other words, this castle is definitely ancient. Anson, carefully observing his surroundings, wasn't studying archaeology or historical truths. Those were the hobbies of the former Anson. He was considering a more practical question. Since this castle has so much history, could it be that the Old Gods faction, cooperating with the Empire, are so enthusiastically causing trouble at Thunder Castle, because something incredible is buried beneath it? Only at times like this does Anson remember that this is a world where, besides steam, steel, and cannons, there are also old gods, magic, supernatural abilities, and bloodlines. Buried in history, besides the truth, is a chilling terror. An epitaph carved on a stone tablet, a coffin buried deep underground, a torn page covered in curses, a chest of gold coins sunk to the bottom of the sea, all could potentially contain some terrifying, unknown, and eerie power. Just as Anson was lost in thought, Carl Bain's voice suddenly rang in his ears. The 2 teams we sent out have responded. Kroger Bernard is neither in his bedroom nor in the map room, not a soul in sight. The upstairs is completely empty. Anson nodded, meaning the enemy could only be in the main hall on the lowest level of the main castle. Carl, his expression growing increasingly serious, stubbed out his cigarette and silently watched Anson, awaiting his orders. Tell those 2 platoons not to follow us. Have them ambush us on the opposite staircase. After a moment's thought, Anson quickly made his judgment. We'll launch the initial attack. If they outnumber us, use a volley of gunfire to warn them, then retreat towards the gate while firing. They can then rush down the side staircase to encircle us, and finally, boom. Anson, who had suddenly stopped, stared wide-eyed, frozen in place like a statue. Commander? Hey, Commander. Sensing something was wrong, Carl immediately grabbed his shoulder to block the soldier's view behind him, whispering something in Anson's ear. He vaguely remembered that the guy in front of him had experienced something similar that foggy morning. But Carl was only half right. This time it wasn't his head. It was his heart. The mark left by the cursed magic was burning Anson's heart. The instant he tried to use his powers to see the scene in the main hall, the images in his mind exploded and churned into a mess, and the six-pointed star mark began to burn his heart. It was like some kind of warning. "Commander, huh?" Startled awake, Anson jolted, his forehead covered in cold sweat, and glanced at Carl Dane, whose expression was extremely tense. Almost as soon as he regained consciousness, his superpowers began to fade, and the burning sensation in his chest gradually weakened, leaving only a slight tingling sensation to remind him of his presence. "How are you feeling now? If you're not feeling well, we can always—" "I'm fine," Anson, still slightly out of breath, interrupted. "Listen, the plan has changed. 2 orders. First, you immediately take the entire regiment and evacuate to the top floor of the main castle, and stand guard at the wooden door. Then, if you notice anything unusual, immediately evacuate the main castle. Remember, anything unusual. Don't hesitate, evacuate immediately." "Okay," Carl replied without hesitation, then pursed his lips and looked at Anson. "And what about you?" "That's the second order." Anson's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Don't ask." Their eyes met, and Carl's expression finally turned serious. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure." Anson nodded seriously with a bitter smile. "This is the best way to save as many people as possible, including yourself." "Do I look like someone who's courting death?" "Not before, but now I do." Looking at Anson, Carl reached out and stubbed out his cigarette, exhaled, and said calmly, "Okay, I'll take them to the top floor to wait for you." After saying that, he waved to the people behind him, turned around and left without looking back. Listening to the footsteps fading away behind him, Anson, his heart pounding, began to descend the stairs to the bottom floor. Chapter 47 arrived just in time. The spiral staircase leading to the main hall was narrow and dark. With each step, Anson felt the risk of slipping and falling. But at this moment, this tangible risk felt strangely reassuring. Gripping his already loaded Leopold rifle tightly, Anson desperately tried to suppress his fear, a slight burning sensation throbbing in his heart. And as he approached the main hall at the bottom, this burning sensation grew clearer and stronger. It felt like his instincts were warning him to stop going any further. There was nothing to worry about. Since the Dark Mage had entrusted this task to a newcomer like himself, it proved that the task itself wasn't difficult. It was just that exposure would have dire consequences. He was only dealing with a member of the Old Gods faction colluding with the Church, Krog Bernard, the commander of the player's Imperial garrison. Considering the other party would likely try to keep it secret, there were at most 10 men under him. Even if he couldn't win, he could always escape. Constantly reassuring himself, Anson took a deep breath and placed his right foot on the last step of the spiral staircase. Before him lay the final door leading to the main hall. Holding his breath, Anson hid behind the wall and slowly pried the door open with the butt of his rifle. A figure strikingly similar to Louis Bernard stood at the dimly lit end of the hall, pulling his sword from the neck of a corpse. The still convulsing body, gushing dark red liquid, was casually tossed among the scattered bones. The main hall was deathly silent, utterly empty. Nothing, except for the smashed, incomplete, disemboweled corpses hanging from the ceiling, splattered on the walls, still twitching and gushing blood from torn muscles, except for the sticky, bubbly liquid smearing the floor and walls, emitting a strong, pungent odor. Nothing at all. Feeling his heart pounding faster and the burning pain in his eyes, Anson barely knew what was keeping him sane. His heightened awareness allowed him, despite the fear, the capacity to observe his surroundings. The entire main hall was covered in smears, Imperial soldiers, Clovis uniforms, and others in black robes, their identities impossible to discern. Their only commonality was that they were all dead. Every face, whole or mutilated, soaked in blood, was cold and stiff, their bulging, lifeless eyes frozen in fear and despair. "You're late, or, you could say you're just in time." The moment the other spoke, Anson, feeling the sticky floor, froze in his tracks. Even though it was just his back, he felt as if he were being watched. Beneath this dilapidated castle lies the body of a blood mage of extraordinary significance. From hundreds of years ago, a voice, sharp as a sword's edge, echoed in Anson's ears. Every blood mage dedicates their life to transcending this fragile mortal body. Immense strength, a sharp mind, immunity to disease, even the desire to cease to be human, and some, even more so, firmly believe that unimaginable power lies within their blood, spending generations, even dozens of generations, in the pursuit of immortality, and this body, and the former master of this castle, was one of them. Undoubtedly, he failed, but it still thrilled a small group of blood mages who discovered this document, believing that by obtaining this body, they could continue their research based on the records. So they exploited the war between the Empire and Clovis, sending a group of people to infiltrate this place before the war broke out. With the help of the Empire, they attacked Thunder Castle from within, obtaining what they wanted. The price was helping the Empire end the war, but now they are all dead, and the Clovis are about to reclaim this castle. Kroger Bernard, speaking slowly and deliberately, one hand resting on the menacing, blood-stained greatsword, as if recounting a story unrelated to him. Anson, suppressing his inner fear, stared stiffly at his retreating figure. Why? Because, Kroger paused, then suddenly raised his head slightly, as if in thought. This is in our best interest, he said. He must mean both him and me, right? Anson's throat tightened, and the muzzle of his rifle rose slightly. Of course, you are a significant reason. Kroger suddenly changed the subject, his head twitching unnaturally. For Kroger Bernard, for me. Louis Bernard, my beloved younger brother, is irreplaceable, so when I mistakenly believed he was sacrificed, I decided to stop dealing with him and truly join forces with those who wanted to use me and lure me into becoming a blood mage. One blood sacrifice after another awakened that corpse that should have been rotting long ago, a corpse that could continuously gain power from blood and multiply. Thud, the blade of the greatsword fell again, like the sound of blood plasma pumping and convulsing after flesh was torn apart, echoing in Anson's ears again and again. But Louis, my dear brother, is still alive, so I changed my mind. For the great name of Bernard, Krog Bernard, who once represented a bright future but was used and controlled by the old gods, has become a burden. The longer it drags on, the easier it is for his identity as a blood mage to be exposed. Anson, his rifle trigger firmly pressed, stared intently at the other's back, reaching for the grenade behind him with his right hand. One grenade left. For Krog Bernard, for me, the Bernard name means everything. Compared to this great and ancient name, all personal honor and disgrace, even life and death, are insignificant. To prevent the glory of Bernard from being tarnished, to cover up certain mistakes, to end this war as soon as possible, Krog Bernard will become the hero of this war, and the victim. In a low, abyss-like echo, Krog Bernard slowly turned, casting his blood-red, crazed eyes upon him. And I will attain eternal life. Anson, his nerves on edge, went completely blank for a moment. The viscous liquid covering Krog's body, seemingly soaked in blood, writhed slowly and erratically like countless living creatures, seeping into his body from his neck, chest, and every exposed inch of skin. His trembling pupils slowly moved upwards, revealing a face that had been divided in two. The left side still bore the handsome features of Louis, while the right side was now a rotting skeleton, reduced to a thin layer of decaying flesh. Excuse me, Anson, his expression somewhat out of control, gripping the grenade tightly, smiled as he asked, are you now Crow Bernard, or that blood mage who died hundreds of years ago? Crow's face broke into a smile, viscous liquid oozing from his rotting right corner of his mouth. Oh, you really should have listened to me, Anson Bach, I said, this is in our best interest. Dragging a greatsword covered in countless pieces of flesh, seemingly brought to life, and staring at Anson with blood-red eyes, Crow strode towards him. I also said, you're too late. Crow Bernard has already devoured the blood mage's corpse, gaining infinitely increased flesh power, but this dregs of flesh is far from enough to give me a new life. Coincidentally, Anson Bach, you seem to be a gifted individual with bloodline power. Upon hearing this reply, Anson's pupils contracted again. The slow-moving Kroger revealed a chilling grin on his rotting right cheek. So, you've come at the right time. Chapter 48 Blood Dance. Watching the figure approaching, dragging the ripping greatsword, Anson, though fully conscious, felt as if bound by something, nailed to the spot. Amidst the decay and crimson, the ghostly figure drew ever closer. Click, his trembling right hand pulled a pin on a grenade, thick white smoke billowing out. Staring intently at the oppressive figure, Anson began to count down in his mind. 1, 2, 3. The black shadow was violently thrown from Anson's hand, flying towards Krog's face. Krog, his right cheek still bearing a smirk, rolled his eyes upwards without raising his head. He stopped, raising the ripping greatsword in his right hand to try and deflect it. Almost simultaneously, freed from his binding, Anson immediately raised his rifle, the already loaded Leopold rifle aimed at the falling black shadow, and decisively pulled the trigger. Smoke billowed, and a straight bullet hole shot out from the muzzle flash, colliding with the white trail of the black shadow in midair. Boom! The explosive flash instantly engulfed Krog's figure. Anson, hit head-on by the heat wave, staggered backward and fell into a pool of increasingly cold blood. It seemed that not all the grenades Roman had sent were unusable, low-quality products. The fallen Anson immediately rolled backward to one knee, almost instinctively pulling back the bolt and rapidly loading ammunition. Blood mist erupted around the exploding flash, and amidst the putrid, acrid smell, the flames still flickering in the blood-soaked ground could be faintly seen. Anson, his forehead covered in cold sweat, stared intently at the center of the blood mist, forcefully locking the bolt. Krog, who had already decided to abandon humanity, couldn't be dealt with by a single grenade. Just then, whoosh, without even a moment to catch his breath, the greatsword, tearing through the blood mist with a piercing shriek, flew straight towards Anson. Bang! Without a second thought, Anson raised his spear at the incoming black shadow, simultaneously rolling to the side to dodge. A fleeting flash of sparks crossed the sword tip, and the slightly deflected greatsword pierced straight through the wooden door behind him. The next moment, Krog's figure burst out of the blood mist, lunging at the still unable to get alive Anson with inhuman speed. Boom! A long bone blade extended from Krog's right arm, crashing down with the force of piercing through the skull. Anson, barely managing to dodge, watched helplessly as the floor tile in front of him shattered instantly upon impact. After the bone blade struck, Krog's once handsome face, engulfed by the explosion, was completely ulcerated, with only bones remaining on his right side. The viscous liquid disappeared, replaced by grotesque, festering flesh that continuously festered and peeled off his body, while simultaneously multiplying from the flesh clinging to the bones, a writhing, pus-filled mass of flesh. Now, Anson, seizing the moment Krog missed, raised his gun and pierced Krog's neck. PFFT, in the instant blood gushed out, the pale afterimage of the bone blade attacked from the right. Anson shuddered and decisively released his Leopold rifle, pushing hard against the buttstock and falling backward. The next moment, the wooden gun barrel was instantly cleaved in two by the bone blade, the severely deformed barrel and bolt parts, like scrap metal, scattered along with the severed gun barrel in the gradually congealing pool of blood. Krog raised his left hand, gripped the bayonet, and elegantly pulled the blade from the blood and pus-spurting neck. Clang! A crisp sound rang out. The steel bayonet snapped in two in Krog's hand. Anson stared in disbelief. Even an explosion and a throat piercing couldn't kill him. Did a headshot really have to work? His desperately trying to think brain was completely blank. No plan. At this moment, facing the enemy before him, Anson couldn't even conceive of a feasible plan. Yes, that's the expression. A chilling voice, like an echo from hell, resounded, and Krog moved. When I devour flesh, I hope you feel the same despair and helplessness. Clang! In the instant of his clumsy side roll, Anson barely managed to create enough distance before the bone blade swung. Thankfully, he had chosen the role of a spellcaster, allowing him to make a sufficiently accurate prediction. Although he now deeply regretted, why hadn't he chosen to be inhuman? Before Anson could even regain his footing, the burly figure wielding a bone blade on his right arm was already upon him again. Unable to dodge in time, he ducked, the pale bone blade's afterimage flashing past his head, the shrill sound of it tearing through the air nearly shattering his eardrums. Kneeling on one knee, Anson drew his sidearm from his waist, desperately trying to think of a way out. The difference in their physical abilities was too great. If the distance closed to within 5 steps, he wouldn't even have the chance to fight back. Even disregarding the opponent's special abilities as a blood mage, he had to try to gain as much room to maneuver as possible. In short, he absolutely couldn't engage in close combat. He had to maintain distance until he could pinpoint the opponent's weakness, but he couldn't exceed 20 meters, otherwise his prediction would be. Anson, straightening himself and drawing his gun, watched helplessly as Krog's clenched left fist came hurtling towards him. Bang! The muzzle flashed, and the spinning bullet exploded, creating a bloody hole in Krog's chest. Anson, struck in the abdomen, was sent flying backward, crashing heavily into the wall of the main hall. Dust and cracks erupted from the wall behind him as his thin body fell to the ground like a rag doll. Blood trickling from his mouth, Anson struggled to his feet, his right arm trembling as he raised his revolver. Bang! 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 Without hesitation, he fired 5 shots at Krog. Krog's chest, riddled with lead bullets, exploded in a spray of pus-filled blood, his slight movement slowing him somewhat. But it was only a slight slowing. The next second, the burly figure was already close again, like a ghost. Gritting his teeth, Anson instinctively dodged to the side. A sharp, pale bone blade flashed past, cleanly severing his right sleeve at the shoulder, the gushing blood instantly staining the entire sleeve crimson. If the angle and distance of his dodge had been even slightly off, the glancing wind from the bone blade alone would have severed his entire right arm. No, he had to think of something quickly. Was there any feasible plan, even just to temporarily restrain him? Even just temporarily hindering his movements would allow him to try and find an opportunity. Thump. Anson, lying in a pool of blood, rolled to the side to dodge, not caring about his disheveled state. But Kroger gave him no chance. As the bone blade missed, the next attack came simultaneously. Thump. Kicked away, Anson flew through the air across most of the main hall, rolling and being dragged several meters in the pool of blood before coming to a stop. His face was deathly pale as he collapsed to the ground, blood still spilling from his mouth, the intense pain in his chest making even breathing incredibly difficult. Clang. Kroger, without immediately rushing forward, first picked up the torn greatsword that had fallen to the ground. Anson, lying on the ground, struggled weakly, his body convulsing. The ear-piercing sound of the blade scraping against the floor echoed in his ears like a death knell, making him struggle even harder. Until, those blood-red eyes, constantly oozing pus, were reflected in his vision again. Despairing, Anson's pupils dilated as he watched Kroger raise the torn greatsword, watching the scene of him entering the main hall replay on his own body. "It's over," Kroger spoke softly, delivering a verdict like the Grim Reaper. At that very moment, bang, a gunshot rang out. A fleeting bullet hole turned Kroger's grinning face into an exploding mist of blood and flesh. If you are listening to this novel on a channel other than Fanfic World, it means it was downloaded and re-uploaded without effort. We warmly invite you to visit our channel, Fanfic World. There you will find the original version of this story and many other novels of various genres. We look forward to seeing you dive into a world of incredible novels. Chapter 49 Death Battle. Clang, with a deafening crash as the greatsword slammed into the ground, the headless, burly body collapsed to the floor. The main hall, reeking of blood and decay, fell silent, like a tomb. Suppressing the pain, Anson turned to look at the burly figure lying in a pool of blood. His head, shattered by a single bullet, remained attached to the neck, flesh and blood oozing from the wound as the still twitching corpse gushed forth. It was over? Crow Bernard, who had devoured the blood mage's remains, had countless entanglements with the old gods, and was feared by both the Black Mage and Lieutenant Colonel Roman, just killed with a single shot? Staring intently at the still twitching corpse, Anson's expression was one of disbelief, but the man was undeniably dead. His head was smashed, it couldn't possibly grow back, could it? Anson. Anson, here, I'm alright, familiar cries echoed in the main hall, causing Anson, lying in a pool of blood, to struggle to lift his head and look in the direction of the gunshot. Lisa. Her petite figure was curled up behind the wall beside the door. If it weren't for the lingering smoke around her and the gun barrel protruding from behind the wall, Anson would have barely been able to spot her with the naked eye. Although he had vaguely guessed who it was the moment the gunshot rang out, Anson's expression was still somewhat complicated when he actually saw her. He had clearly told Carl that he was going to, well, never mind. Pressing his right rib, which ached as if it were broken, Anson gave a self-deprecating laugh and struggled to get up from the ground. Having almost been killed, he didn't seem to have any right to complain. Looking at the petite figure still hiding behind the wall, seemingly afraid, Anson's lips twitched. He suddenly remembered that the Black Mage had mentioned that the surname August was very ancient, even dating back to before the founding of the Kingdom of Clovis, and was very likely connected to the old gods. Following this line of thought, Carl's decision to send only Lisa August down didn't seem to be a violation of his orders, and it didn't expose the secret of the old gods' members in Thunder Keep. Well, maybe? Anson, trying to reassure himself, staggered towards Lisa. Just then, click, the little girl, her eyes fixed on Anson, trembled as she pulled back the bolt and skillfully loaded ammunition into the chamber. Huh? Anson froze, his expression somewhat bewildered. The next second, Lisa, desperately trying to suppress her trembling, bit her lower lip, as if making a decision. She suddenly pointed the still smoking muzzle at his face. Lisa, Anson remained motionless, his right hand gripping the empty revolver, while secretly hiding a lead bullet in his left palm. Anson, Lisa, biting her lower lip and her pupils still trembling slightly, suddenly took a deep breath and roared at the figure, "Anson! Get down!" Without time to think, Anson immediately lunged to his left. Bang! In the instant the muzzle flashed, the spiraling bullet struck the air and exploded into a shower of sparks. Kroger Bernard, who should have been dead, had somehow risen from the pool of blood, his rotting, decaying body once again raising that hideous, gruesome greatsword. His head had been blown apart, leaving only a hideous, horrifying gash. The charred marks had long since disappeared, and the festering flesh beneath writhed wildly. The pustules constantly repairing the lost parts. Whoosh! The greatsword, deflected by the lead bullet, swung again, the black afterimage almost grazing his cheek, emitting a soul-shaking shriek. Having dodged the fatal blow, Anson didn't even have time to think. His left hand, gripping the lead bullet, immediately activated his only remaining, gathering flame. Simultaneously, he tried to quickly move behind a nearby pillar to evade Krog's pursuit. But Krog completely ignored him, abruptly turning and charging towards the petite figure still reloading. "Lisa, run!" Just as Anson hurriedly shouted, Lisa, unable to reload in time, decisively abandoned her weapon and turned to run in the opposite direction from Anson. Only then did Anson notice that Lisa was carrying 3 or 4 different types of rifles on her back, and a revolver slung over each of her thighs. Clearly, Carl hadn't let her come down empty-handed. The headless, burly figure lunged straight at him, the shrill sound of a tearing greatsword crashing down. Boom! In the shadows of smoke and blood, the fully armed Lisa narrowly avoided Krog's fatal blow. Her leaping figure used a foot to step over the wall and landed behind the headless figure. Krog, having missed his target, whirled around, his right hand wielding the greatsword that tore through the wall, sending sparks flying, before slashing horizontally at the petite figure who had just landed. Lisa, her feet planted firmly on the ground, leaned back, dodging the blade. In that instant, she braced herself with one arm against the Bernier rifle, using her knee as a support, and aimed the muzzle at Krog's right shoulder joint. Bang! The shot struck, the spiraling bullet piercing Krog's right shoulder from under his armpit. Krog's right arm slumped, the greatsword crashing to the ground. But the next second, the headless Krog, with his writhing flesh, somehow managed to pull his broken arm back up and swung the greatsword once more. Lisa, eyes wide with terror, stared at the incoming blade. It was too late, rushing forward was too late. Anson, writhing in pain, gritted his teeth, raised his revolver, and decisively pulled the trigger. Bang! The next second, the lead bullet fired at Krog's chest burned eerily, leaving a long trail of flame in midair. Boom! A spell, gathering flames, engulfed Krog in golden red light. Simultaneously, the shockwave slammed into Lisa, sending her flying into a pool of blood. She suffered only minor injuries and fell unconscious. The ability to accurately judge distances to everything around them and react instantly, this was the power of a spellcaster. Whoosh! The flames subsided, and Krog, wielding his greatsword, stood unharmed in the pool of blood. Anson, his face stiff, stared intently at the figure, his lips twitching slightly. Headshots were ineffective, lead bullets were ineffective, grenades were ineffective, and even his only magic was ineffective. He was out of options. Krog, dragging his torn greatsword, closed in on him again. Should he run? No, it was too late. Anson frowned slightly. Given his current physical condition, he knew that the moment he tried to escape, he would be pierced through the chest by a sword from behind and torn to pieces. He didn't intend to die, much less die here. Even with the slightest chance, he would defeat this monster that wanted to devour him. Since that was the case, he would have to use a more risky strategy. Taking a deep breath, Anson, panting heavily, once again pulled lead bullets from his ammunition pouch, slowly imprinting the flame-gathering mark on them. He loaded them one by one into the magazine. Then, he aimed at the headless figure. Boom, 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 boom. Almost without pause, the cold-faced Anson fired 6 shots in quick succession. Golden red flames erupted one after another around Krog, the roar of the explosion shaking the entire main hall. The dancing flames and flying sparks quickly ignited the blood smeared on the floor and walls. In the raging inferno, Crow's body was once again engulfed by flames. His clothes and hair were gone, chunks of flesh charred and falling away, only to be replaced by rapidly proliferating flesh and pustules. Where his head had once been, a tumor of countless gushing pustules had taken its place, and in the center, a blood-red eyeball had regrown, if it could still be called an eyeball. If the previous Crow Bernard had at least resembled a normal person, now he was a complete monster. His greatsword, along with his right hand, was blasted away, but this did not stop Crow. From the center of the severed arm, a pale bone blade emerged again from the writhing flesh. Seeing the approaching figure, the expressionless Anson discarded his empty revolver and drew his sword from his waist. With his left hand behind his back, he turned sideways, assuming an offensive stance. Thud, the gleaming blade pierced Crow's chest. PFFT, Anson jolted, his lips pressed tightly together, staring intently at the bone blade piercing his chest. Blood gushed uncontrollably from his mouth. And, son, Lisa, struggling to wake from the pool of blood, stared wide-eyed at the image of Anson lying there. Tears streamed down her face, which was covered in dust and blood. AA. Chapter 50, Unsealed. A heart-wrenching scream erupted from her petite body. Like a rabid beast driven mad, Lisa roared at the monstrous Krog. Die, sensing the commotion, Krog froze, his blood-red eyes, encased in fleshy growths, turning behind him. A pale, blood-stained bone blade, propelled by his writhing arm, was raised above his head to meet the oncoming figure. Clang, the thrusting bayonet clashed with the descending bone blade, dazzling sparks brushing against the little girl's flowing hair. But Lisa, her eyes red, was not knocked back. Instead, she withstood the impact, pointing her gun at Krog's head and roaring as she pulled the trigger. Bang! The brain formed by his blood-red eyes and fleshy growth shattered instantly in the gunshot, and Krog staggered back 2 steps, blood and flesh splattering everywhere. Kill it, tear it apart. Make it pay for Anson's death. A sharp, mournful scream, like the howl of a vengeful ghost, exploded from Lisa's throat, crashing relentlessly into Krog's chest. His head shattered, Krog staggered and lost his balance, only to be knocked to the ground. The next second, Lisa, still gripping the still-smoking, hot barrel of her rifle, plunged most of the gun into Krog's chest. PFFT, blood and flesh gushed from his chest, splattering onto his angry, helpless face. Krog, lying on the ground, had just raised his bone blade when Lisa retaliated, severing his arm with another shot. Tears streaming down her face, Lisa simultaneously drew her revolvers from her sides, the black muzzles roaring at the monster amidst the little girl's cries. AA. Lisa, crying incessantly, was surrounded by a crimson blur. A strange impulse surged within her young body, and her rage gradually swelled to a single thought: torture it, torment this pile of flesh. Tear it apart, rip it to shreds. Destroy it. Click, click, click. Lisa, having emptied her ammunition, instinctively pulled the trigger. Almost simultaneously, Krog's left arm began to writhe violently, its swollen flesh slamming into Lisa's chest like a cannonball. Thump. Lisa, sent flying, crashed against the wall behind her, a series of groans echoing from her ribs. The empty revolver fell from the sky, plunging into the burning blood. But in the next instant, the petite figure, having landed heavily, rose again, her reddened eyes fixed viciously on the writhing mass on the ground, rising like a remolded lump of mud. The monster named Krog, his chest pierced by a gun barrel and bayonet, had his writhing flesh filling the shattered parts of his head once more. The eye sockets pierced by lead bullets were now bloody holes. Anson, who had taken him in, was dead. Anson, who had given him food, was dead. Anson, who had freed him from sleeping in the woods, was dead. Anson, whom he had promised to protect, was dead. Anson, who had protected him, was dead. Killed by that monster. A monster. Die, crying and screaming. Lisa, her eyes now bloodshot, lunged at Krog again. In the burning sea of blood, the petite figure and the headless, fleshy monster once more charged at each other. Thump. In the boundless darkness, a powerful voice jolted Anson awake from his daze. Familiar, yet somewhat strange, something he often heard, but often ignored. What was it? His gradually awakening consciousness groped in the darkness, his chaotic memories flashing before his eyes like countless images. Every drop of bloodline power is proof of a gifted individual. As that somewhat familiar voice rang out, Anson found his consciousness beginning to clear. What had just happened? This is a power hidden within your bloodline, or more precisely, a part of your body. Kroger Bernard had slaughtered the old gods of Thunderhold, devoured the corpses of blood mages, and used their blood to awaken the power within them, transforming them into a monster that endlessly multiplied flesh and blood. He had almost died at Kroger's hands, saved by Lisa who arrived just in time, but he was completely helpless against Kroger, whose head had been smashed open and who remained unharmed. And then? Why, couldn't he remember even the slightest thing? Desperately trying to recall, Anson's consciousness once again sank into chaos. Thump. The familiar sound rang out again. It was as if something ramped up was shattering, slowly tearing a crack in the darkness before him. Startled awake, Anson stopped thinking and began to listen intently to the voice. Everyone's bloodline power is unique and diverse, and inextricably linked to your level of self-awareness. Thump. Anson finally remembered, it was the sound of a heartbeat. His heart was still beating, he wasn't dead. Wait a minute. Before he could feel joy, Anson was immediately plunged into immense confusion. Why did he think he was dead? What had he forgotten? Therefore, I suspect your bloodline power cannot be used in a normal state, or is so weak that even if you unintentionally use it, you wouldn't be able to detect it. Thump. A crisp, powerful sound rang out, and the darkness before Anson began to shatter, blinding light seeping through the cracks. Immediately afterward, Anson felt his heart burning fiercely, as if it had been sealed away, suppressed for far too long, and was now eagerly tearing apart the darkness that enveloped it. Regardless of the type of bloodline power, in principle, it requires a high degree of concentration to be effective. It is part of your body, like limbs or organs. Remember, many outstanding talents have suffered irreversible consequences because of this. Boom. A sound like something shattering echoed in Anson's ears. The darkness that had sealed his consciousness was replaced by raging flames. The flames that had gathered at his heart began to spread along his limbs under Anson's control, gradually igniting his entire body. His cold blood gradually began to warm up. In a daze, his body seemed to be undergoing a process of rebirth. He felt his bones regrowing, his strong, beating heart constantly gushing fresh blood, his decaying flesh and shattered bones melting and disintegrating under an unknown force, and the flesh and blood of his limbs and bones regenerating. Slowly let this power awaken within your body. It will begin to strengthen you. You'll find that when you activate your bloodline power, both your physical and mental strength will significantly improve, and you'll begin to exhibit special abilities. Although I don't believe there are inherently stronger or weaker bloodline powers, many abilities manifest in ways that exceed people's imagination. Some focus on physical strengthening, some influence those around them, some exist on a spiritual level, and some can even foresee certain upcoming events. This process is incomparably painful, and it's not instantaneous, but rather like a relentless tide, gradually reshaping his body step by step with the raging flames. As the fire subsided, Anson heard his heart beat again, felt his blood flowing through his body. The power that had risen with the flames, like the ashes after the fire subsided, dissolved into his body. He felt it, he felt that power. It was giving him a new life. End of this chapter. Thank you so much for reading until the end. Don't forget to give it a like. Looking for more exclusive content and immediate access? Subscribe to our Patreon. Remember, every like, subscription or donation encourages us to continue. Thank you all. See you in the next video.